History doesn't always tell you everything. Sometimes it whispers, and buried inside the timelines we memorized in school, between the wars, the empires, the names carved into stone, are gaps, silences, moments where something happened that nobody could explain, and the world quietly moved on, pretending it didn't. But we're not moving on. For the next 3 hours, we're pulling back the curtain on the cases that kept historians awake, the discoveries that rewrote entire textbooks, and the vanishings that still have no answer. Welcome to the strange side of history. Let's begin. Somewhere beneath the cracked, sun-bleached earth of modern-day Turkmenistan, something waits. It has waited through the rise and fall of empires, through Mongol invasions so violent they reportedly turned rivers red, through centuries of silence, wind, and slow geological burial. It waited while the world above it changed beyond recognition, and it is still waiting now. This is Merv, once one of the largest cities on Earth. At its peak in the 12th century, historians estimate its population may have rivaled that of medieval London or Cairo, a sprawling, breathing metropolis positioned at the crossroads of the ancient Silk Road. Merchants, scholars, astronomers, and diplomats passed through its gates. Its libraries were legendary, its gardens reportedly breathtaking, and beneath all of it, a network of tunnels that nobody has fully explained. Archaeological surveys conducted in recent decades have confirmed what local oral tradition had quietly preserved for centuries. Merv sits above an elaborate system of underground passages. Some stretch for significant distances. Some connect key structures within the city. Others appear to lead nowhere obvious. The mainstream explanation is practical and reasonable. Medieval Islamic cities frequently used underground systems called kharez, ancient irrigation channels designed to transport water from distant sources into arid urban centers. Merv, positioned deep in the Karakum Desert, would have depended on such infrastructure for survival. Water was power. Water was life. It makes complete sense that an empire-level city would invest heavily in managing it underground. And yet, some of the passages discovered beneath Merv don't align neatly with irrigation logic. Their dimensions are inconsistent with water flow. Certain corridors appear deliberately sealed, not collapsed over time, but closed, intentionally, by someone who didn't want them reopened. Archaeologists working the site have noted chambers branching off from the main tunnels. Small rooms, alcoves, spaces that suggest purpose beyond the movement of water. So what were they for? One school of thought points to military function. Merv was invaded repeatedly throughout its history, most catastrophically by the Mongols in 1221 AD, a siege so brutal that historical accounts, likely exaggerated but rooted in real devastation, speak of millions killed. A city anticipating siege would logically invest in escape routes, hidden supply corridors, and subterranean refuges. The tunnels in this reading were architecture born from fear. Others suggest something more administrative, or perhaps more sacred. Merv was a deeply important city within the Islamic world, home to significant religious institutions and centers of learning. Some researchers have raised the possibility that certain underground spaces served as secure vaults, repositories for manuscripts, treasures, or religious texts during times of threat. Libraries, in a sense, buried for protection. And then there are the theories that exist further from the academic consensus, quieter suggestions, passed through local communities and occasional fringe researchers, that some of Merv's underground network predates the medieval city itself. That it was not built by the great Islamic civilization that made Merv famous, but inherited by it. Built by an earlier hand for purposes we haven't yet defined. There is, at present, no definitive evidence for this. But there is also no definitive evidence against it. What makes Merv uniquely haunting isn't just the tunnels themselves. It's the scale of what was lost above them. When the Mongols swept through in the 13th century, they didn't just kill, they erased. Records, institutions, living memory. The people who knew exactly what lay beneath the city were gone. The tunnels survived. The knowledge of them didn't. And so the question lingers, quiet and unresolved, beneath the desert heat. What was Merv trying to protect? And did it succeed? Merv asked us what was worth protecting. What knowledge, what treasure, what secret justified being buried beneath an entire civilization? Half a world away, built into the limestone cliffs of northern Spain, another structure seems to ask the very same question. The monastery of San Millán de la Cogolla sits in the La Rioja region of Spain, nestled quietly against the slopes of the Sierra de la Demanda Mountains. To look at it is to feel the weight of centuries pressing gently but firmly against your chest. The stone is old, genuinely, profoundly old, worn smooth in places by wind, rain, and the hands of countless pilgrims who made this journey long before anyone thought to record their names. It is one of the oldest monastic sites in Spain. Portions of its structure date back to the 6th century AD, built around the cave where a hermit named Milan, later canonized as Saint Emiliano, reportedly lived, prayed, and eventually died. The site grew slowly around his memory. A chapel here, a cloister there, layer upon layer of devotion stacked across more than 1,000 years of continuous religious life. In 1997, UNESCO recognized the monastery as a World Heritage Site, citing its extraordinary historical significance, including its connection to the earliest known written examples of the Spanish and Basque languages, preserved in manuscripts called the Glosas Emilianenses, marginalia, essentially. Small handwritten notes scrawled into the margins of a Latin text by an unknown monk, sometime around the 10th or 11th century. Casual, almost accidental words that became, centuries later, the first fragile seeds of an entire linguistic tradition. A place that gave birth to a language, a place built on top of a cave, a place where, according to a growing number of researchers and historians, something beneath the main structure has never been fully opened or explained. The sealed chamber. Accounts of its existence are not new. Local monastic tradition has referenced a blocked or inaccessible space beneath the older sections of the complex for generations. Early architectural surveys of the site noted irregularities in the lower foundations, spaces that didn't correspond to any documented room, corridor, or utility passage in the monastery's historical records. Not every anomaly in an ancient building is significant, of course. Foundations settle, rooms are repurposed, bricked over, forgotten. This is the ordinary archaeology of very old places. But the chamber beneath San Millán has resisted ordinary explanations with quiet persistence. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 2000s identified a void beneath the oldest section of the complex. A space of meaningful size, not simply an air pocket or structural gap. The dimensions, as interpreted from the survey data, suggest something deliberate, something constructed. And the access point, wherever it once existed, appears to have been closed, not by time or structural failure, but by human decision. Someone sealed it. The question is who and why. The practical explanations deserve fair consideration. Monasteries throughout medieval Europe commonly maintained undercroft spaces, lower chambers used for storage, as burial crypts, or as places of private prayer. It is entirely plausible that the chamber beneath San Millán served one of these functions and was sealed during a later renovation, its purpose made redundant, its entrance quietly incorporated into new construction. Religious institutions are not always systematic record keepers of their own architectural decisions. Things get closed off. Things get forgotten. But researchers who have examined the monastery's documented history point to a specific and unusual gap. The sealing of the chamber, based on available architectural evidence, appears to have occurred sometime during the 11th or 12th century, a period of significant political and religious turbulence across the Iberian Peninsula. The Reconquista was reshaping the region. Monasteries were under varying degrees of threat, protection, and transformation. Valuables were hidden. Archives were moved. Decisions were made quickly, under pressure, with permanence that was perhaps never intended to be quite so lasting. What would a monastery choose to hide during such a period? The Glossas Emilianenses manuscripts, those extraordinary early linguistic documents, were preserved above ground and eventually moved to the Royal Academy of History in Madrid, where they remain today. So if the chamber holds something, it isn't those. But San Millán was more than a linguistic archive. It was a center of considerable religious and political influence for centuries. It received donations of land, relics, and objects from kings and nobles across the region. Its library, at various points in its history, was described as one of the most significant in northern Spain. Not all of that library has been accounted for. Some researchers, working carefully at the edges of what the available evidence actually supports, have raised the possibility that the sealed chamber may contain manuscript materials that predate even the Glossas. Texts from the Visigothic period, perhaps, or earlier. Documents that, if they exist, would rewrite portions of what we understand about early medieval religious and cultural life in the Iberian Peninsula. Others have suggested something more physical. Relics, perhaps, of the kind that held enormous theological and political significance in the medieval world. Objects whose concealment might have been considered an act of protection rather than secrecy. In a world where the possession of a saint's remains could legitimize an entire institution, the careful burial of such objects beneath sacred ground was not unusual. It was, in its own way, an act of reverence. And then there are the quieter suggestions, less documented, more speculative, that the chamber's origins may predate the monastery entirely. That Milan, the 6th century hermit who chose this particular cliff face for his solitary life, may have chosen it because something was already there. A natural cave, certainly. But perhaps more than that. The monastery was built around a holy man's memory. But holy men throughout history have had a tendency to seek out places that already felt sacred, that already carried some quality of stillness, of weight, of significance that preceded them. What did Millán find in that cliff? The limestone is silent on the matter. The sealed chamber, if it exists as the surveys suggest, offers nothing yet. And the monastery above it continues its life of quiet devotion, centuries deep, its foundations holding whatever they hold. Patient, sealed, and waiting for a question that hasn't quite been asked yet. There is something almost unbearable about a question that refuses to close. San Millán gave us one, a sealed chamber, a missing archive, a cliff face that chose its secrets carefully. But as we move deeper into this exploration, we find that sealed spaces are not unique to the cold stone monasteries of medieval Europe. They appear again and again across vastly different cultures, vastly different centuries, as though the human instinct to hide something sacred, to bury it, protect it, preserve it against a world in flux, is not a cultural habit, but something closer to a universal impulse. We travel now to northeastern Africa, to the Sudanese desert, to a place most of the world has never heard of and almost certainly underestimates. Old Dongola sits on the eastern bank of the Nile, in what is today central Sudan, roughly 350 kilometers south of the modern city of Khartoum. From a distance, it looks like ruins. And it is in the technical sense. Mud brick walls eroded to soft geometry, structures half reclaimed by sand and wind. The quiet, particular desolation of a place that was once genuinely, enormously alive and is now largely forgotten by the wider world. But Old Dongola was not a minor settlement. At its height, between roughly the 7th and 13th centuries AD, it served as the capital of Makuria, one of the most powerful Christian kingdoms in medieval Africa. While much of the surrounding region was transforming under the expansion of Islam, Makuria held. It negotiated. It traded. It produced art, architecture, and religious scholarship of remarkable sophistication. Its cathedral, built in the 7th century and later converted into a mosque, still stands, partially, its walls carrying the ghost of frescoes that once covered them in vivid, extraordinary color. Beneath that cathedral, Polish archaeologists working the site over several decades have uncovered something they did not expect. A crypt, or more precisely, a series of subterranean spaces that extend beneath the main structure in ways that continue to resist complete documentation. Initial excavations revealed burial chambers, as might reasonably be expected beneath a major religious building of this period. The remains of individuals of apparent high status were found. People buried with care, with objects, with the deliberate attention given to those whose deaths were considered significant. But the burials themselves raised more questions than they answered. Some of the interred individuals showed evidence of burial practices that blended Christian and pre-Christian Nubian traditions in ways that scholars are still working to understand. Objects found alongside the remains included items whose origins stretched far beyond the immediate region, materials and craftsmanship suggesting trade connections, or perhaps diplomatic gifts reaching into the Byzantine world, into the heart of Africa, and possibly further still. The mainstream interpretation is historically grounded and compelling. Makuria was a crossroads kingdom, a civilization that absorbed and synthesized influences from multiple directions simultaneously. Its Christianity was genuine, but not Roman. Its culture was distinctly Nubian, shaped by millennia of civilization along the Nile that predated Christianity by thousands of years. It would be entirely consistent with everything we know about Makuria that its royal or ecclesiastical burials would reflect this rich, layered identity. And yet the deeper archaeologists have moved into the subterranean spaces beneath the cathedral, the more the picture has complicated itself. Certain sections of the crypt appear to predate the cathedral above them by a significant margin. The construction technique, the material composition, the orientation of specific walls. These details have led some researchers to suggest that the Christian builders of Old Dongola's great cathedral did not simply build on empty ground. They built on top of something that was already there, something older, possibly much older. The Nile Valley, it bears remembering, is one of the longest continuously inhabited corridors on Earth. The region around Old Dongola had been home to organized, complex societies for thousands of years before the first Christian missionaries arrived. The Kingdom of Kush, the civilization of Meroe, cultures whose religious architecture, whose understanding of sacred space, whose relationship to burial and the afterlife were sophisticated and deeply rooted long before the 7th century AD. Is it possible that the Cathedral of Old Dongola was built, as so many sacred structures throughout history have been built, on a site already considered holy, already carrying the weight of older prayers, older dead, older meaning? The evidence does not confirm this, but it does not dismiss it either. What makes the situation at Old Dongola particularly tantalizing is the question of what remains unexcavated. The Polish archaeological mission has done extraordinary work under genuinely difficult conditions. The site is remote, the climate unforgiving, the logistics considerable. But by their own assessments, significant portions of the subterranean complex have not yet been fully explored. There are passages that have been identified but not entered, chambers that have been located through survey but not yet opened, and there is, among those working the site, a particular awareness that the written records of Makuria, its chronicles, its theological texts, its administrative documents, have largely not survived. Unlike the monasteries of Europe, which generated and preserved paper trails across centuries, Makuria's literary culture was largely lost. We know it existed. We know it was substantial, but we cannot read it, which means that whatever the Cathedral of Old Dongola was built to house, whatever its builders considered worth placing beneath the most sacred structure in their kingdom, we have no document that tells us plainly what it was. The sand has kept that answer, and somewhere beneath those eroded walls, in chambers that have not seen light for the better part of 1,000 years, the Nile continues its ancient indifference, flowing north as it always has, carrying nothing away, giving nothing back. What did the kings of Makuria consider sacred enough to bury beneath the house of their god? And does it still lie there, waiting to be found? The dead of Makuria were buried with intention, placed beneath sacred ground, surrounded by objects that crossed continents, sealed beneath a cathedral that itself became a ruin. Whatever they were meant to preserve, They preserved it in darkness, protected by sand, by remoteness, by the simple fact that the world largely forgot to look. But not every mystery is born from careful concealment. Some are born from violence. We move now from the quiet banks of the Nile to the wind-swept plateau of eastern Anatolia, to the border region between modern Turkey and Armenia, where the ruins of a city called Ani rise from the grassland like the bones of something enormous. Long dead, but still recognizable. Ani is not widely known outside academic and architectural circles. It should be. At its peak in the late 10th and early 11th centuries AD, it was the capital of the Bagratid Armenian kingdom, a city of perhaps 100,000 people, rivaling Constantinople in both population and architectural ambition. Its skyline was defined by churches, palaces, and fortified walls of such sophistication that visitors from across the medieval world recorded their astonishment in writing. It was called, by those who saw it, the City of 1,001 Churches. Today, those churches are shells. The walls still stand in places, but emptily. The wind moves through Ani with a particular quality. Not peaceful, exactly, but resigned. As though the city itself has long since made its peace with what happened to it. What happened to it was catastrophic and repeated. Seljuk invasion in 1064, Georgian occupation, Mongol devastation in the 13th century, earthquake, abandonment. Each wave of destruction left its layer in the archaeological record, compressed into the earth beneath the ruins like geological strata of human suffering. And it is within those layers, specifically beneath one of Ani's lesser documented structural complexes, that archaeologists have found something that continues to resist clean explanation: the burned chamber. It was identified during excavation work conducted in the latter half of the 20th century, beneath a section of the city associated with administrative or possibly religious function. The chamber itself is not large, roughly the dimensions of a substantial room, its walls and ceiling marked by burning so intense and so uniform that the stone itself was altered. Vitrified in places. Fused. The kind of heat signature that does not come from a building fire spreading downward from above, but from something burning within the chamber itself, at temperatures that required either extraordinary fuel, extraordinary duration, or both. The straightforward interpretation points to deliberate destruction. Ani was sacked multiple times. It is entirely plausible, historically consistent even, that retreating inhabitants or advancing invaders set fire to whatever the chamber contained. Libraries have been burned throughout history. Archives deliberately destroyed to deny enemies access to administrative records, financial documents, or theological materials. The burning of a chamber's contents would be an act of war or of desperate preservation, destroying what could not be carried, ensuring it could not be used. This explanation is reasonable. It may well be correct. But it doesn't fully account for the pattern of the burning. Researchers who have examined the chamber in detail have noted that the heat damage is inconsistent with a conventional fire fed by organic material: wood, parchment, fabric. The distribution of vitrification on the walls suggests the heat source was central and sustained, not spreading. Some of the damage patterns appear on surfaces that would have been largely inaccessible to a fire-burning conventional fuel. It is, in the careful language of the relevant academic literature, anomalous. What was burning in that room? One line of inquiry focuses on the metallurgical. Ani was a sophisticated urban center with documented craft industries, including metalworking of considerable refinement. It is possible that the chamber served an industrial or alchemical function, that what burned was not a collection of manuscripts or relics, but materials associated with metal processing, glassmaking, or the production of substances whose thermal properties we are only now beginning to fully understand in their historical context. Another line of inquiry is more uncomfortable for the mainstream, though not without its proponents. A small number of researchers have pointed to the chamber in the context of broader questions about thermal technology in the ancient and medieval world, questions about whether certain civilizations possessed knowledge of heat-generating processes that has since been lost or misattributed. These suggestions remain firmly outside academic consensus. They are raised here not as conclusions, but as part of the honest landscape of what has been proposed. What adds another layer of complexity is what was found within the chamber alongside the evidence of burning. Fragments. Not enough to reconstruct clearly, but enough to suggest the former presence of objects, their precise nature unclear, their material composition in some cases difficult to categorize given the degree of thermal alteration. Whatever was in that room, the fire did not simply consume it cleanly. It transformed it into something that raises questions of its own. Ani as a whole remains significantly under-excavated. The site sits in a politically sensitive border region, and access has been complicated and inconsistent across decades. Large portions of the city have never been systematically examined. What lies beneath the residential quarters, beneath the palace complexes, beneath the churches whose floors have never been lifted, this remains genuinely unknown. The burned chamber is one answered door that opened onto a corridor of new questions. And the corridor, for now, extends further than anyone has yet been able to follow. Ani was a city built by people of extraordinary capability and ambition. It was destroyed by forces that cared nothing for what it had created. Somewhere in the gap between those two facts, between the building and the burning, something was lost. And the question that lingers over those blackened stones, quiet and insistent, is simply this. Was what burned in that chamber destroyed by the fire? Or was the fire itself the last act of people determined that certain things would never be found? Annie asked us whether destruction can be deliberate enough to constitute a secret, whether fire, applied with precision and intention, can be a form of burial as effective as any sealed chamber or desert sand. It is a question worth sitting with. Because as we move westward across Anatolia, across the same vast plateau that once trembled under Mongol hooves and Armenian prayers, we arrive at a landscape that seems, at first glance, to belong to another world entirely. A place where the earth itself became architecture, where entire cities were carved not upward into the sky, but downward, into the soft volcanic rock beneath the surface. This is Cappadocia. The region sits in the heart of modern Turkey, defined by one of the most visually extraordinary landscapes on Earth. Centuries of volcanic activity and slow erosion have sculpted the terrain into towering columns of pale stone, formations called fairy chimneys, rising from valleys of deep layered color. It is beautiful in the way that very old, very strange things are beautiful. Not comforting, not gentle, but genuinely, almost aggressively, remarkable. And beneath that surface, stretching downward through multiple levels of carved rock, lie some of the most elaborate underground habitats ever created by human hands. The underground cities of Cappadocia, Derinkuyu, Kaymakli, and others still being mapped, are not small refuges. Derinkuyu alone descends at least 8 levels beneath the surface, with ventilation shafts, wells, stables, kitchens, communal spaces, and religious rooms carved with evident planning and considerable skill. It is estimated to have been capable of housing tens of thousands of people simultaneously, along with their livestock and supplies, for extended periods of time. The rolling stone doors that could seal individual corridors from the inside are among the most quietly chilling architectural details in the ancient world. Large, circular, immovable from the outside. They were not built to keep people in. They were built to keep danger out. The accepted historical narrative attributes the extensive use of these underground systems largely to early Christian communities, populations seeking refuge from Roman persecution in the 1st centuries AD, and later from Arab raids during the 7th and 8th centuries. This is well documented and historically sound. The presence of chapels, crosses carved into stone walls, and other unmistakably Christian iconography throughout the underground complexes confirms a deep and sustained connection to early Christian life in the region. But the Mongol invasions of the 13th century introduced a new and significantly more intense wave of violence across Anatolia. And it is in the context of that particular period, and the particular evidence left behind from it, that certain questions about Cappadocia's underground occupants become harder to answer cleanly. When archaeologists have examined the deeper, less documented sections of the underground complexes, areas that show evidence of habitation during the 13th century specifically, they have found traces of occupation that do not fit neatly into the established picture of Christian refugee communities. Personal effects, remnants of material culture, objects whose stylistic and material characteristics suggest origins and identities that complicate the simple narrative of local Christian populations sheltering from Mongol advance. Some items appear consistent with populations from significantly further east, displaced by the Mongol expansion across Central Asia and Persia, moving westward ahead of the violence in patterns that historical records only partially capture. Who, exactly, was hiding in Cappadocia's deepest rooms during the height of the Mongol period? The mainstream answer acknowledges demographic complexity. The 13th century was a period of enormous population movement across the entire region. Anatolia was absorbing refugees, displaced communities, and traveling groups of widely varied backgrounds. It would be historically consistent, unremarkable even, for Cappadocia's underground cities to have sheltered a genuinely diverse population during this period, including groups whose presence in the region was itself a consequence of Mongol violence further east. This explanation is probably largely correct, but it leaves certain specific findings unexplained. In some of the deeper chambers, sections that appear to have been sealed from within and not reopened until modern excavation, archaeologists have found evidence of what appears to be deliberate curation. Objects arranged with care, materials stored in ways that suggest not desperate flight, but considered intentional preservation. The behavior not of people hiding temporarily, but of people who believed they might not return, who were leaving something behind on purpose. What were they leaving? For whom? Some researchers have pointed to the possibility that certain occupants of the Cappadocian underground during this period were not simply refugees, but custodians, individuals or communities whose primary purpose in descending beneath the earth was the protection of specific materials, knowledge, or objects of significance. The Mongol advance destroyed libraries, institutions, and repositories of knowledge across an enormous geographic range. It is not implausible that organized efforts to preserve what could be preserved would have included strategic concealment in places as remote and defensible as Cappadocia's underground network. And then there are the sections of the underground complex that remain, to this day, incompletely explored. Passages that have been identified but not fully followed. Connections between known chambers that suggest a more extensive network than current maps reflect. In 2013, construction work in the nearby city of Nevşehir revealed an entirely new underground complex of potentially enormous scale, one that, years later, remains only partially investigated. Cappadocia's underground world is, in the most literal sense, not yet fully known. The fairy chimneys above cast long shadows in the late afternoon light. Below them, carved into rock that absorbed the sounds of 10,000 hidden lives, the corridors run deeper than the maps show and quieter than language can quite capture. Somewhere in those unexcavated passages, behind one of those great rolling stone doors that no outside force ever managed to open, is there still something waiting, exactly as its last keeper left it, in the patient and absolute dark? Cappadocia taught us something important, that the most carefully kept secrets are not always the ones locked behind sealed doors or buried beneath cathedral floors. Sometimes the most enduring mysteries are the ones left in plain sight, recorded, referenced, even described in detail, and then simply lost, not destroyed, not concealed, just gradually separated from the physical world they once described, until the words remain but the place they point to has vanished from every map we have. This is a different kind of mystery, and in some ways, it is the most disorienting kind of all. Ibn al-Athir was one of the most significant historians of the medieval Islamic world. Born in 1160 AD in the Jazira region of what is today northern Iraq, he spent decades assembling one of the most comprehensive chronicles of his era, a monumental work known as Al-Kamil fi al-Tariq, or The Complete History. It is not a fringe document. It is not the work of an unreliable narrator or a writer prone to embellishment. Scholars across centuries have relied on Ibn al-Athir's chronicle as a foundational primary source for understanding the political, military, and cultural history of the medieval Middle East. His observations on the Crusades, the Mongol invasions, and the internal dynamics of Islamic governance remain essential reading in academic circles to this day, which is precisely what makes a particular passage in his chronicle so difficult to dismiss. In a section dealing with the military campaigns of the late 12th century, Ibn al-Athir makes reference to a fortress, a significant one, by his account, situated in a mountainous region along what was then a contested frontier zone between competing powers. He names it. He describes its position with enough geographic specificity to suggest he was drawing on reliable sources, possibly eyewitness accounts. He references it in the context of military strategy, implying that its location was considered tactically valuable, a controlling position over a key route or valley that made it worth fighting over. And then, across the entirety of the subsequent historical and archaeological record, it disappears, not captured and renamed as far as anyone has been able to determine, not destroyed and documented as destroyed, not absorbed into another settlement whose identity obscures its origins. Simply absent, unlocated. A named, described, strategically significant fortress that exists with apparent confidence in one of the medieval world's most respected historical texts, and nowhere else. Historians have proposed several frameworks for understanding this absence. The most straightforward is geographic imprecision. That the regional descriptions in Ibn al-Athir's account, filtered through the knowledge of his sources and the cartographic limitations of his era, do not translate cleanly enough to modern geography to allow confident identification. The frontier zones of 12th century Anatolia and the broader Levantine interior were complex, contested, and inconsistently documented. A fortress that one chronicler considered significant might be referenced under an entirely different name, or not referenced at all, in sources from the opposing side of the same conflict. This is a reasonable position. Historical geography is genuinely difficult, and the mismatch between medieval place names and modern ones has obscured many real locations for long periods before eventual identification. But the fortress Ibn al-Athir describes has resisted identification with unusual persistence. Researchers who have worked specifically on the problem, cross-referencing his account with Byzantine, Armenian, and Crusader sources from the same period, have been unable to find a convincing match. The geographic parameters he establishes, read carefully, appear to narrow the possible location to a specific and not overly large area. Satellite imaging and remote sensing surveys of that area have identified structural anomalies in the landscape, patterns inconsistent with natural formation, suggestive of worked stone and deliberate construction. But ground surveys have so far been inconclusive. The region in question is not easily accessible. Political complexity, difficult terrain, and limited research infrastructure have combined to make systematic archaeological investigation genuinely challenging. What might be visible from the air remains untouched at ground level. Some scholars have raised a more provocative possibility, that the fortress was not simply lost to geographic imprecision, but that it was deliberately removed from the record. That following its military significance, it became the site of something, a massacre, a treaty violation, an act of political betrayal, that made its erasure from subsequent documentation advantageous to one or more of the parties involved. Medieval chronicle tradition was not without its strategic omissions. Powerful patrons shaped what was preserved and what was quietly set aside. If the fortress was the site of something that powerful people preferred unremembered, its absence from the broader record begins to feel less like an accident and more like a decision. And then there is the question of what Ibn al-Athir chose not to say directly, but implied with a specificity that strikes careful readers as unusual. His description of the fortress includes a brief, almost incidental reference to what appears to be an underground component, a lower section, he suggests, that served a function distinct from the military fortifications above. He does not elaborate. He moves on, as historians do, to the next event in his chronology. But he mentioned it. In a text not given to unnecessary detail, he paused long enough to note that the fortress had something beneath it. What was underneath a fortress significant enough to appear in one of the medieval world's great chronicles, and obscure enough to have vanished entirely from the physical landscape? The mountains of the old frontier hold their silence with the particular authority of places that have witnessed too much history to be impressed by the questions of any single generation. Somewhere in that landscape, if Ibn al-Athir's sources were as reliable as his reputation suggests, stone walls still stand in some configuration. And below them, whatever he considered worth mentioning in passing waits in the same darkness it has occupied for the better part of 1,000 years. Ibn al-Athir's fortress lingers in the mind the way unfinished sentences do, present enough to be felt, absent enough to be unsettling. A name without a place, a description without a destination. History, reminding us that the written word and the physical world do not always remain tethered to one another across the long passage of centuries. But what happens when the physical world survives? When the stones are still there, still touchable, still measurable? And it is the meaning that has been lost. That is a different kind of absence entirely. We travel now to the northern coast of Africa, to Tunisia, to a low promontory jutting into the Mediterranean where, for nearly 7 centuries, one of the ancient world's most formidable civilizations built, traded, prayed, and ultimately fell in one of history's most deliberate acts of annihilation. Carthage. The name alone carries a particular weight. Founded, according to tradition, around 800 BC by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is today Lebanon, Carthage grew from a colonial outpost into something the ancient Mediterranean had not quite seen before. A maritime empire of extraordinary commercial sophistication, a naval power that challenged Rome for dominance of the known world across 3 brutal wars spanning more than a century. A civilization that produced its own art, its own religious tradition, its own understanding of the sacred. And that was, in 146 BC, destroyed with a comprehensiveness that Roman historians themselves recorded with a kind of uneasy pride. The city was not simply defeated. It was dismantled, its population killed or enslaved, its physical structures demolished. The ground, according to the most dramatic ancient accounts, though historians debate the literal truth of this detail, salted so that nothing would grow there again. And yet Carthage did not entirely disappear. Beneath the Roman city built over its ruins, beneath the Byzantine structures layered above that, beneath the Arab and Ottoman and modern Tunisian city that exists today, fragments of Punic Carthage have survived. Buried, compressed, partially destroyed but not entirely. Archaeological work across the 20th and early 21st centuries has recovered enough to confirm that the civilization Rome tried to erase left traces that erasure could not reach. Among those traces, discovered during excavation work in the latter decades of the 20th century, is a subterranean complex in the area associated with the ancient city's religious quarter, a structure that does not correspond neatly to any documented Carthaginian religious form, and whose abandonment appears to predate the Roman destruction by a margin significant enough to raise serious questions about what it was and why it was left. The complex is underground. Its construction shows evidence of deliberate design. This was not a natural cave or an opportunistic use of existing space, but a purpose-built subterranean environment. The walls show traces of what appear to be decorative or symbolic markings, degraded to the point where their precise nature is difficult to establish with confidence, but present enough to suggest that whoever used this space considered its visual environment important. Objects recovered from the site include ceramic fragments, the remnants of what may have been offering vessels, and traces of organic material consistent with ritual burning. Incense, perhaps, or other aromatic substances whose use in religious contexts was widespread across the ancient Phoenician world and its colonial extensions. The mainstream interpretation places the complex within the broader context of Punic religious practice. Carthaginian religion was rich and somewhat opaque to outside observers. Its deities, particularly Balhaman and Tanit, were powerful presences in civic and private life, and the physical spaces devoted to their worship ranged from grand public temples to intimate, semi-private shrines whose archaeological footprint is modest but real. An underground shrine of relatively small scale would not be historically anomalous. Sacred spaces in the ancient world were frequently subterranean, associated with chthonic deities, with the dead, with the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beneath it. But the abandonment is harder to explain within this framework. The evidence suggests the complex was vacated carefully, not fled from in panic, not destroyed by external force, but methodically emptied and closed. Certain fixtures appear to have been removed deliberately. The entrance was sealed in a manner consistent with intentional closure rather than structural collapse. Whatever rituals had been conducted in this space, they ended by choice, not by catastrophe. Why would a functioning religious shrine be deliberately abandoned and sealed, potentially generations before the Roman destruction that ended Carthaginian civilization entirely? Some researchers have connected this question to what is known, and what remains deeply contested, about a period of religious and political turbulence within Carthage itself during the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. The city underwent significant internal stress during this period, including conflicts over religious authority, the influence of Hellenistic culture on traditional Punic practice, and political power struggles whose details survive only in fragmentary and often hostile sources. It is conceivable that the abandonment of the underground shrine reflects one of these internal ruptures, a specific cult or priestly tradition displaced, suppressed, or simply discontinued as the city's religious landscape shifted. Others have suggested something that sits further from consensus, but has not been entirely dismissed: that the shrine's contents, whatever they were removed to a secondary location before the closure. That the sealing was not an ending, but a misdirection. That what the shrine contained was considered important enough to move, and obscure enough that its destination was never recorded in any source that has survived. Carthage was a civilization that Rome wanted the world to forget, and Rome, for a time, nearly succeeded. But the ground remembers what the conquerors tried to erase. It holds the fragments. It preserves the outlines. It keeps in the patient darkness beneath the modern city's noise and light the physical evidence of a spiritual life that the ancient world's most aggressive power decided should not continue. And somewhere in that evidence, in the sealed entrance, the carefully emptied rooms, the traces of worship that ended by choice rather than force, is the unanswered question of what was considered sacred enough to hide, and whether whoever hid it ever intended it to stay hidden forever. Carthage left us with the image of empty rooms, carefully emptied, deliberately sealed. A religious life concluded not by violence, but by quiet, considered withdrawal, as though whoever performed those final rites understood that they were the last, and acted accordingly. There is something in that image that stays with you. The idea that a people facing the slow erosion of their world would respond not with chaos, but with order. With the deliberate act of inscription, of leaving a mark, arranging a space, sealing a door, as though meaning itself could be preserved through the right sequence of careful gestures. And it raises a question that will follow us through this next chapter. What happens when the marks are left, but the meaning is not? We move now from the North African coast eastward across the Mediterranean world, deep into the Syrian desert, into a landscape that has no interest in softening itself for visitors. The eastern Syrian steppe, the Badia, is vast, pale, and largely empty by modern standards. The horizon is uninterrupted in every direction. The light is fierce in a way that seems less like illumination and more like exposure, as though the desert is determined to leave nothing hidden. It is, in its own extreme way, a landscape that demands honesty. And yet, rising from this mercilessly open terrain, the ruins of Qasr al-Hayr al-Sharqi, known in the archaeological literature as Qasr al-Hayr II, present the eye with something entirely unexpected. Walls, towers, the remains of an enclosure of considerable scale, built with evident ambition, and now standing in a silence so complete that the structure seems less like a ruin and more like a question posed to the empty sky. Qasr al-Hayr II was constructed in the 8th century AD under the Umayyad Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, who ruled the Islamic world from 724 to 743 AD. It was part of a broader tradition of desert palatial complexes, structures built by Umayyad rulers across the Syrian and Jordanian desert, whose precise function has been debated by historians for generations. Palace retreats, certainly. Agricultural estates, possibly. Way stations on trade and administrative routes, plausibly. The Umayyad desert complexes were sophisticated environments that blended residential, agricultural, and ceremonial functions in ways that resist simple categorization. Qasr al-Hayr II was among the largest of these. Its outer enclosure covered an enormous area. It had its own water management system, its own agricultural infrastructure, its own bath complex. It was not a temporary outpost, but a sustained investment, a statement of presence in a landscape that seemed to resist human permanence. And on the interior surfaces of its walls, in spaces that were not public-facing decorative areas but internal rooms and corridors less likely to receive casual visitors, someone carved symbols that have not been satisfactorily explained. They are not Quranic inscriptions. They are not the standard administrative or dedicatory texts that typically accompany Umayyad construction. They are not graffiti in the conventional sense, casual marks left by travelers or later occupants. They are carved with deliberation, with evident familiarity with whatever system they represent, and with a consistency that suggests a single hand or a closely coordinated group working from shared knowledge. Their forms are geometric in character, but not purely decorative. Certain elements recur with the regularity of a system, repeated combinations, varied arrangements, structural patterns that researchers who have examined them carefully describe, cautiously, as potentially encoding information rather than simply expressing it aesthetically. The mainstream scholarly response to the symbols has been measured and appropriately cautious. Qasr al-Hayr II was built at a moment of significant cultural synthesis. The early Umayyad period saw the collision and fusion of Byzantine, Sasanian, Arabian, and broader Levantine traditions in ways that produced genuinely hybrid visual and intellectual cultures. It is entirely possible that the symbols represent a local or regional marking tradition, masons' marks, property indicators, or craft guild notations, whose conventions were widespread in their own time and simply have not survived in enough other examples to allow modern decipherment. This is a reasonable position. Much of what looks mysterious in the ancient and medieval world becomes ordinary once enough comparative material surfaces. But the symbols at Qasr al-Hayr II have resisted this kind of normalization with persistent stubbornness. Researchers who have attempted systematic comparison with known marking traditions from the relevant period and region have not found convincing matches. The internal consistency of the symbol set suggests a closed system, one with its own grammar, so to speak, rather than a collection of marks drawn from a broader, loosely shared convention. And their placement, specifically in interior spaces of limited visibility and access, argues against purely functional interpretations like property marking or construction notation. Why carve a systematic, internally consistent symbol set in rooms that relatively few people would enter? Some researchers have placed the symbols in the context of esoteric or Sufi traditions, whose presence within early Islamic culture is historically documented, but often poorly understood in its material expressions. The 8th century was a period of intense theological and mystical development within Islam, and certain strands of that development, particularly those concerned with sacred geometry, the hidden dimensions of language, and the relationship between visual form and spiritual meaning, might plausibly have produced exactly this kind of interior, non-public inscription. Others have suggested a connection to pre-Islamic symbol systems that persisted in the region long after the formal conversion of its population, Nabatean, Aramaic, or older traditions whose practitioners may have found in the relative privacy of a desert palace's interior rooms a space for continued expression. And then there are those who note, without drawing firm conclusions, that certain of the symbol combinations at Qasr al-Hayr II bear a structural resemblance to notational systems found in contexts geographically and culturally distant enough that the resemblance, if genuine, would require an explanation that current historical frameworks do not easily provide. The desert around the ruins is unchanged from what it was in the 8th century. The same pale light, the same vast silence, the same quality of exposure, and on those interior walls, carved by hands whose owners understood perfectly what they were writing. A message waits, patient and complete, for the reader who has not yet arrived. The symbols at Qasr al-Hayr II reminded us of something quietly unsettling. That language, real, structured, intentional language, can exist in complete isolation from understanding. That meaning can be present in a room, encoded with care and precision by someone who knew exactly what they were saying, and remain entirely inaccessible to every mind that encounters it afterward. The message and its reader, separated not by destruction or concealment, but simply by the erosion of the shared key that once connected them. It is a particular kind of silence, not the silence of absence, the silence of something present that will not speak in any tongue we currently know. But there is another kind of silence worth considering, one that is, in its own way, even more disorienting, the kind that breaks. We move now from the Syrian desert westward, back across the ancient world, to the southwestern coast of what is today Turkey, to the region the Greeks called Korea, to a landscape of gentle hills, scattered ruins, and olive groves that have been growing in the same stony soil for so long that the distinction between the cultivated and the ancient feels meaningless here. Everything is old. Everything has been touched by more hands than memory can account for. And in this landscape, in the ruins of a sanctuary that once drew pilgrims from across the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, something has been reported with a consistency that spans not decades, but centuries. Voices. At night, without a source. The sanctuary at Lagina was dedicated to Hecate, one of the most complex and widely misunderstood deities of the ancient Greek world. She was not simply a goddess of witchcraft, as later tradition reduced her. She was older and stranger than that, a figure of boundaries and thresholds, of the spaces between night and day, between the living world and whatever lay beyond it, between knowledge and its absence. She was invoked at crossroads. She was associated with the moon, with dogs, with keys. In the ancient imagination, she was the figure who stood at the edge of the known and looked outward into what the known world could not contain. Her sanctuary at Lagina was significant, not merely a local cult site, but a major religious center that achieved considerable prestige during the Hellenistic period, roughly the 3rd through 1st centuries BC, and continued to function under Roman rule for centuries afterward. Inscriptions recovered from the site record a rich institutional life. Priesthoods, festivals, processions, dedications from individuals of means and status. The temple itself, whose remains archaeologists have partially reconstructed, was architecturally accomplished, its frieze considered one of the finest examples of Hellenistic relief sculpture in the region. It was, in other words, a real place, a historically documented, archaeologically confirmed center of religious life. Not a legend, and the voices reported around it are not a legend either, at least not in the sense of being undocumented. Ancient sources referencing Lagina include accounts of auditory phenomena associated with the sanctuary, particularly at night. These descriptions are not sensationalized in the texts that preserve them. They are mentioned with the matter-of-fact tone that ancient writers often applied to things they considered unusual, but not necessarily inexplicable within their own cosmological framework. Hecate was a goddess of night and boundary. Sounds at her sanctuary after dark were, within that framework, consistent with her presence. They were experienced as confirmation, not anomaly. What complicates the dismissal of these accounts is that they did not end with the ancient world. Travelers visiting the Lagina site during the Ottoman period recorded unease around the ruins at night, descriptions that, while culturally framed entirely differently from their ancient counterparts, describe auditory experiences with a notable consistency. Not dramatic supernatural encounters, but something quieter, and more persistent. Sounds that did not correspond to identifiable environmental sources, a quality of acoustic strangeness that visitors noted and found difficult to attribute. And in the modern period, researchers and archaeologists working the site have occasionally documented similar observations, carefully in the understated language of people aware of how such reports are received in academic contexts, but present in the record nonetheless. The rational framework for understanding these reports is well developed and genuinely compelling. Lagina sits in a geologically active region. The subsurface of southwestern Turkey is complex. Fractured rock, underground water systems, seismic microactivity that produces infrasound and low-frequency acoustic phenomena, largely imperceptible to conscious hearing, but capable of generating profound unease, disorientation, and in some documented cases, auditory hallucinations in sensitive individuals. Researcher Vic Tandy's work on infrasound in the late 1990s demonstrated measurably that certain low-frequency sound environments produce exactly the kinds of experiences, presence, dread, peripheral visual disturbance that haunt the historical record of sites like Lagina. This explanation is serious, scientifically grounded, and probably accounts for a significant portion of what has been reported at the site across centuries. But it raises a question that the explanation itself cannot fully answer. Did the ancient priests of Hecate know? The placement of her sanctuaries, Lagina among them, shows a consistent pattern of selection that modern geological survey has confirmed correlates with areas of unusual subsurface acoustic activity. Crossroads, cave mouths, specific valley configurations that funnel and amplify low-frequency sound. The geography of Hecate's worship, mapped against what we now understand about acoustic geology, does not look accidental. If the ancient world understood, empirically if not scientifically, that certain places produce certain experiences, and built their theology of threshold and boundary around that physical reality, then the night voices at Lagina are not a mystery to be debunked, but a technology to be understood. A deliberate choice of location by people who knew what the ground would do after dark. The ruins are quiet in daylight. Stones, grass, the distant sound of wind moving through the hills. Archaeological notations, the patient work of reconstruction. But if you were to remain there past sunset, past the hour when the boundary Hecate governed begins to feel less metaphorical, would the ground beneath Lagina still speak in the frequency it spoke in for 1,000 years of worship? And would you, standing alone in that ancient dark, be entirely certain of what you were hearing? Lagina asked us whether ancient people understood something about the physical world that they encoded into theology rather than science. Whether the geography of worship was, in some cases, a map of acoustic and geological phenomena that the modern world is only now beginning to measure and name. It is a thought that reshapes how we look at sacred spaces, not as sites chosen arbitrarily or purely through spiritual intuition, but as locations selected with an empirical precision that wore the language of the divine because no other language yet existed for what was being observed. Which brings us naturally to the people who spent their lives in the most sustained and disciplined act of observation the medieval world produced. The monks. Not mystics in the popular imagination sense, not figures of pure otherworldly devotion disconnected from the practical world. The great monasteries of medieval Europe were, among many other things, institutions of extraordinary intellectual rigor. They preserved knowledge. They copied, annotated, and in many cases, expanded it. Their libraries were among the most significant repositories of human understanding in the Western world, maintained across centuries of political instability by communities whose continuity outlasted kingdoms, dynasties, and wars. And sometimes, in those libraries, something disappeared. The monastery of Hirsau sits in the Black Forest region of what is today southwestern Germany, in the valley of the Nagold River. Its ruins are genuinely beautiful in the way that very old, very broken things sometimes are. The remaining walls of the Romanesque church rising from the trees with a quietness that feels earned rather than accidental. The monastery was founded in the 9th century and rose to particular prominence in the 11th century under Abbot William of Hirsau, who transformed it into one of the most influential monastic reform centers in the German-speaking world. At its height, Hirsau was not simply a local institution, but a model, a template for monastic life that dozens of other communities across the region adopted and replicated. Its library was, by all contemporary accounts, exceptional. Catalogs and references from the 11th and 12th centuries describe a collection of considerable depth. Theological works, classical texts, scientific and astronomical manuscripts, historical chronicles, and materials whose specific nature is referenced in surviving documents only obliquely in the careful, elusive language that medieval scholars sometimes used when describing works whose content was considered sensitive or whose circulation required discretion. Among these references, appearing in more than one independent source from the period, is a manuscript described in terms that have occupied a small but serious community of researchers for several generations. The descriptions are not identical, which argues against simple copying between sources and suggests genuine independent knowledge of the same object. But they converge on certain consistent details. The manuscript was old, significantly older than the Hirsau collection itself, suggesting it had been acquired or transferred from another source rather than produced within the monastery. Its content involved, according to the most careful reading of the available descriptions, a systematic treatment of natural phenomena, celestial, terrestrial, and acoustic, in a framework that one source describes with a Latin phrase, translating roughly as knowledge preceding the current order of knowing. What does that mean? Medieval scholars were precise with language in ways that modern readers sometimes underestimate. The phrase is not mystical flourish. It appears to be a genuine attempt to categorize a text that did not fit within the established frameworks of 11th century European knowledge. A work that described natural phenomena through a systematic approach that its medieval readers recognized as rigorous, but could not place within any known tradition of scholarship. Where had it come from? Who had written it? In what intellectual context had this framework for understanding natural phenomena been developed? The sources do not say. Or if they once said, those portions have not survived. What is documented is that the manuscript was present in the Hirsau library during the late 11th century. What is equally documented is that it is not present in any catalog, inventory, or collection that has been traced from the monastery's subsequent history. The 30 Years' War of the 17th century was catastrophic for Hirsau. The monastery was sacked and burned in 1692, its library largely destroyed or dispersed. This event accounts for the disappearance of much of what Hirsau once held, and the straightforward explanation for the manuscript's absence is simply that it burned with everything else. This is probably what happened. The destruction of Hirsau's library was thorough and well documented, and the survival of any specific manuscript through that event would require either fortunate removal beforehand or extraordinary circumstance. But researchers who have worked the question carefully have noted something that the straightforward explanation does not fully address. In the decades before the 1692 destruction, during the early stages of the 30 Years' War, when the monastery's situation was deteriorating and its community was making decisions about what could be saved, there is evidence of deliberate dispersal of certain holdings. Selected manuscripts were moved to where, in most cases, the record does not clearly show. Was the manuscript among them? There is a tradition, documented in regional monastic correspondence from the early 17th century, of a text from Hirsau being transferred to a secondary location for safekeeping, a text described in terms consistent enough with the earlier references to suggest it may be the same work. The secondary location is named, but the institution named no longer exists, and its own archives have never been fully recovered. The trail ends there. Not in fire, necessarily, but in the particular archival darkness that falls when institutions dissolve and their records scatter into private hands, attic collections, and the uncatalogued holdings of institutions that receive materials without fully understanding what they had been given. Somewhere in a European archive, cataloged under a description that does not reveal its true nature, or simply uncatalogued, waiting in a box that has not been opened in a generation. A manuscript may exist that describes natural phenomena through a framework that medieval scholars recognized as coming from before their own order of knowing. And the question it poses, patient across 1,000 years, is not simply what it contains, but where it came from, and what tradition of understanding produced it, and whether that tradition left any other traces in the world that we have simply not yet learned to recognize. Lagina asked us to consider the possibility that the ancient world understood things about physical reality that it expressed in theological language. That what we read as superstition may have been, at its core, something closer to observation. A accumulated knowledge of how certain places behave, acoustically, geologically, psychologically, translated into the only framework available for recording it. It is a humbling thought. The idea that the distance between ancient understanding and modern science may be smaller than we assume, and that the gap runs in both directions. But if Lagina represents the mystery of knowledge encoded in experience, our next destination represents something rawer, more immediate, less philosophical, and more visceral in the way that only the direct confrontation with human remains can be. We travel now to the northeast of England, to Northumbria, a name that itself carries the weight of an older world. A kingdom once. A landscape of moors and coastline and river valleys that the Romans fortified, the Anglo-Saxons settled, the Vikings raided, and the Normans eventually absorbed into an England still taking its final shape. Northumbria has layers in the way that only places of prolonged, contested habitation develop layers. Each era pressing down on the one before it, compressing history into a density that the soil here seems almost physically to express. It is in this landscape, specifically in the grounds associated with a minor ecclesiastical site, whose name does not appear in the major chronicles and whose existence was, for centuries, known primarily to the communities immediately surrounding it, that a discovery was made in the mid-20th century that has not received the attention it deserves. A crypt, undocumented in the available historical record of the site, accessible through a collapse in the floor of a structure that had itself been largely forgotten. A small stone building whose function had been variously interpreted as a storage facility, a later medieval chapel, and simply an agricultural outbuilding by the succession of people who used the land above it without apparent knowledge of what lay beneath. When the floor gave way and the space below was first examined, what the initial investigators found was not what anyone had anticipated. Burials. Multiple individuals. Arranged with evident deliberateness in a space too purposefully constructed to be anything other than a dedicated interment site. The bodies had been placed, not simply deposited. The positioning of the remains suggested care, ritual attention, the involvement of people who considered what they were doing significant. But the detail that transformed a notable archaeological find into something considerably more difficult to process was immediately apparent. The skulls were not with the bodies, not displaced by time or structural disturbance. The pattern of skeletal arrangement was otherwise largely intact, suggesting the remains had not been significantly disturbed since interment. The crania were absent, deliberately, systematically absent, placed, in several cases, between the legs or beside the lower body of the individual to whom they belonged. A consistent pattern across multiple burials. Not accident, not decay. A choice. The individuals themselves, based on osteological analysis and the material evidence recovered with them, appeared to be male, adult, and associated with monastic life. Remnants of what may have been habit fabric survived in fragmentary form. The material culture of the site, modest, functional objects consistent with religious community life, pointed toward a small monastic establishment of the early medieval period, operating somewhere between the 8th and 11th centuries AD, the dating range within which the remains appear to fall. The mainstream interpretation of headless burials in early medieval Christian contexts is well established and genuinely illuminating. Decapitation as a mode of execution was practiced throughout the period. Executed individuals, criminals, traitors, enemies, were sometimes buried with their skulls repositioned as a marker of their status, a physical record of how they died. In some traditions, the placement of the skull between the legs or at the feet was a specific convention associated with particular categories of condemned individuals. But this framework, applied to the Northumbrian crypt, generates more questions than it resolves. Executed criminals were not, as a rule, interred with the care and deliberateness evident in these burials. They were not placed in purpose-built crypts. They were not arranged with the quiet attention that the skeletal positioning here suggests. The treatment of these individuals, headless though they were, is inconsistent with the disposal of the condemned. It looks, in every respect except the absent crania, like honorable burial, which means either that the individuals were executed but nonetheless accorded respect by those who buried them, a scenario with its own range of implications, or that the decapitation was not punitive, that it served a different purpose entirely. Post-mortem decapitation in early medieval burial practice had meanings beyond execution. In certain traditions, it was performed to prevent the dead from rising, a physical precaution against the specific and genuinely feared phenomenon of the revenant, the corpse that returned. Other traditions associated the separation of head and body with specific ritual protocols around particularly powerful or spiritually significant individuals, saints, martyrs, figures whose physical remains were considered capable of independent sacred action. The relics of decapitated saints were among the most prized in the medieval world. Their skulls, specifically, were objects of intense veneration. If the monks of this forgotten Northumbrian crypt were decapitated after death for ritual rather than punitive reasons, the question shifts significantly. From who killed them, to who considered them important enough to treat this way, and to where the skulls went. Because they are not in the crypt, they were not found anywhere on the associated site. Whoever buried these individuals with such evident care removed the crania and took them elsewhere, kept them, possibly venerated them. The site has not been fully excavated. The surrounding ground has not been comprehensively surveyed. The documentary record of the area, sparse for this period, as it is throughout early medieval Northumbria, has not yielded any reference that scholars have been able to connect with confidence to this specific location. There is no name attached to these monks, no chronicle entry marking their deaths, no record of whatever community they belonged to, or whatever event ended it so completely that even its memory failed to survive in the sources that preserve so much else from this period. The moor above the crypt is unchanged by what lies beneath it. The wind moves across the grass with the same indifference it has always had. And somewhere, in another crypt perhaps, in a wall cavity of a church that still stands and still holds services on Sunday mornings, in a collection whose provenance was long ago separated from its true origin, the skulls of the Northumbrian monks may still exist. Still venerated perhaps by people who no longer know why, still carrying whatever made them worth taking across 1,000 years of forgetting. The Northumbrian monks left us with an absence at the center of the mystery, not the absence of evidence, but the absence of the most personal thing a human being possesses: the face, the skull, the part of the body that, in every culture across every period of recorded history, has carried identity more completely than any other. Someone took those skulls deliberately. Someone considered them worth keeping, and in doing so, they transformed a burial into a question that the intervening millennium has not been able to answer. Identity, it seems, is at the heart of what haunts us most persistently, and nothing makes that clearer than a tomb that contains exactly the right number of bodies and entirely the wrong person. We move now southward and eastward from the windswept moors of northern England into the complex, contested landscape of the medieval Levant, to the region that, during the Crusader period, became the stage for one of history's most violent and sustained collisions of faith, politics, and territorial ambition: the Crusader states. Those fragile, often fractious Latin Christian kingdoms established across parts of modern Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine following the First Crusade produced a material culture of considerable archaeological richness. Castles, churches, fortifications, and tombs that survive in varying states of preservation, each one a compressed record of lives lived at the intersection of enormous historical forces. The tomb in question belongs, or belonged by its original inscription and design, to a crusader lord of middling but genuine historical significance. A man whose name appears in the documentary record of the Latin East in the late 12th century, associated with a specific lordship, specific military campaigns, and a specific network of political alliances that placed him at the edges of the major events of his era without ever quite placing him at their center. He was, in the language of historical assessment, a secondary figure, important enough to leave traces, not important enough to receive sustained scholarly attention. His tomb was identified and examined during archaeological work in the latter half of the 20th century. The structure itself was consistent with the funerary conventions of the Crusader nobility. Stone construction, inscribed with identifying information, positioned within a religious complex whose association with the lordship in question was historically documented. When the tomb was opened, a skeleton was inside, as expected. What was not expected was that the skeleton did not belong to the man whose name was on the tomb. Osteological analysis was unambiguous on several critical points. The individual interred was not male. The remains were those of a woman, adult, of relatively robust physical constitution, buried without the indicators of status or personal ornamentation that typically accompanied elite female interment in the Crusader context. No jewelry, no fabric remnants suggesting fine clothing, no objects that would have marked her, in death, as someone of the standing consistent with the tomb's external presentation. She was placed in a tomb built for a Crusader lord, with his name carved above her. Sometime, the physical evidence suggests, not long after the tomb's original construction. She was not an intrusion from a later period. She was an early, possibly original, occupant. And the man whose name is on the tomb has not been found anywhere else. The mainstream frameworks for understanding this discovery are genuinely multiple, and each carries its own weight. The Crusader period in the Levant was one of intense instability, sieges, reconquests, rapid political transformation that could render a burial site inaccessible, dangerous, or simply irrelevant to those responsible for managing the remains of the dead. It is historically documented that Crusader tombs were disturbed, relocated, and repurposed during periods of conflict. The remains of the actual lord may have been moved, lost in transit, interred elsewhere under circumstances that were never recorded, or simply displaced by events that no surviving document captures. The woman may have been a practical solution to a specific problem. A body available at a moment when the tomb required an occupant for reasons, legal, religious, political, that made an empty tomb unacceptable. This sounds callous by modern standards, but the medieval relationship to burial and bodily remains was complex and often pragmatic in ways that sit uncomfortably with contemporary sensibility. But this explanation, while plausible, cannot account for everything the physical evidence presents. The woman's remains show evidence of a healed injury, a significant one, to the left arm, consistent with trauma that would have required sustained recovery. The nature of the injury has led some researchers to suggest, carefully, that it may have been sustained in a context of physical violence rather than accident. The bone remodeling indicates she survived whatever caused it by a considerable period. Years, not weeks. She lived with this injury. It became part of her physical identity in a way that the skeleton permanently records. Who was a woman bearing the marks of survived violence, buried in the tomb of a Crusader lord in the Latin East in the late 12th century? The range of possibilities is genuinely wide. The Crusader states were, despite their ideological self-presentation, demographically complex environments. Latin Christian nobility lived in sustained proximity to Muslim, Orthodox Christian, and local populations of varied backgrounds. The boundaries between these communities, in the private and domestic spaces of daily life, were considerably more permeable than the official record suggests. Women moved across these boundaries in ways that the documentary record, largely produced by and for elite Latin men, captures only obliquely. She may have been a member of the Lord's household whose relationship to him was intimate enough to warrant burial in his tomb, but irregular enough to warrant the absence of identifying inscription. She may have been a local woman, Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, whose connection to the Lord and his family was of a kind that medieval convention would not have named openly, but that those responsible for the burial considered worthy of acknowledgement in this quiet, ambiguous way. Or she may have been someone whose presence in that specific tomb was not a gesture of honor, but of concealment, placed there not to be remembered, but to ensure that the tomb appeared occupied. To close a question that someone, for reasons we cannot now recover, needed closed. The Lord's absence is as eloquent as the woman's presence. Two mysteries occupying the same stone space, each one the possible explanation for the other, neither one yielding to the pressure of the available evidence. The tomb sits in a landscape that has absorbed more than its share of history's unresolved questions. The inscription weathers slowly. The stone holds what it holds. And beneath the name of a man who may never have lain there, the unnamed woman keeps whatever secret placed her in his tomb. Patient, unidentified, and in possession of a story that the historical record, for all its surviving detail, has never found a way to tell. The unnamed woman in the Crusader tomb reminded us that identity, its presence, its absence, its deliberate obscuring, is one of history's most persistent tools of mystery. A name carved in stone above the wrong body, a face we cannot reconstruct, a story that the surviving record seems almost to be actively withholding. But identity in the ancient and medieval world was not only a matter of names and faces, it was also a matter of objects, of what was placed alongside the dead, of what a culture considered important enough to send with a person into whatever came next. And nowhere in the archaeological record of the early medieval world is that relationship between identity, death, and objects more dramatically expressed than in the tradition of the burial ship. We travel now northward, to the edges of the Baltic world, to the low, saturated landscapes of coastal Scandinavia and the southern Baltic littoral, where land and water have never quite resolved their boundary dispute. Marshes that are neither fully one nor the other. Ground that yields underfoot with a quality that feels less like soil and more like a slow, patient reluctance to commit. These are landscapes that have swallowed things whole and kept them, preserving in their cold, anaerobic depths materials that would have vanished within decades, anywhere drier, anywhere more decided about its own nature. The Baltic marshes are, in this sense, accidental archives. The Norse and Germanic peoples of the early medieval period, roughly the 5th through 11th centuries AD, practiced a funerary tradition whose archaeological record has been transformative for our understanding of the era. Ship burials, the interment of the dead within actual vessels, sometimes enormous ones, accompanied by objects of extraordinary richness and variety, and then covered by mounds of earth that preserved what lay beneath them against the ordinary processes of decay. The most famous of these, Sutton Hoo in England, the Oseberg ship in Norway, are known quantities. Excavated, studied, displayed in museums whose visitor numbers speak to the enduring power these discoveries hold over the public imagination. They represent the pinnacle of a funerary tradition that was widespread, culturally central, and practiced across an enormous geographic range. But the marshes of the southern Baltic have yielded something that sits alongside these famous discoveries and has, for reasons partly practical and partly circumstantial, received considerably less attention. A series of buried vessels, not all ships in the full ceremonial sense, but watercraft of varying scale, identified through a combination of ground-penetrating radar surveys, accidental discovery during agricultural and drainage work, and the slow accumulation of reports from local communities across several decades. The vessels are distributed across a landscape that, in the early medieval period, would have been significantly wetter than it is today. A coastline of inlets, shallow bays, and marshy margins that provided both the cultural context for maritime burial and the preserving conditions that make recovery possible 1,000 years later. Some of these vessels have been partially excavated. What has been found inside them is, in the most precise sense of the word, remarkable. The expected elements are present: skeletal remains, personal objects, weapons in some cases, tools, the residue of organic materials that once comprised clothing, food offerings, or ritual substances. This is consistent with the known tradition of Norse and Baltic Germanic ship burial and confirms the cultural affiliation of those responsible. But certain of the vessels have produced material that extends beyond the expected inventory in ways that specialists have found difficult to place within the established framework of the tradition. Objects of non-local origin, not trade goods in the conventional sense, not the amber, furs, and silver that moved routinely through Baltic exchange networks, but items whose manufacture and material composition suggest origin significantly further afield. Byzantine craft traditions, possible Abbasid metalwork. In one case, an object whose closest parallels in the archaeological literature come from contexts associated with the Silk Road trade networks of Central Asia. How did objects of this provenance end up in burial vessels sunk into the marshes of the southern Baltic? The mainstream answer invokes the well-documented reach of Viking Age trade and raiding networks, routes that connected Scandinavia to Constantinople through the great river systems of Eastern Europe, and that placed Scandinavian traders and warriors in contact with the full material culture of the medieval world from the British Isles to the Caspian Sea. It is not historically implausible that objects of distant origin would find their way, through gift exchange, trade, or plunder, into the possession of individuals significant enough to receive ship burials. This is probably correct, at least in part. But the distribution of foreign objects across these specific marsh burials shows a pattern that some researchers have found difficult to explain through ordinary trade alone. The concentration is unusual. The specific types of objects, not prestige display items of the kind typically associated with elite gift exchange, but functional objects whose value appears to have been personal rather than political, suggest individuals whose connection to the distant cultures these objects represent was something more intimate than a single trading voyage or a fortunate act of plunder. Who were these people? What had they seen and where had they been that made these particular objects the ones worth sending with them into the marsh? Some researchers have raised the possibility that certain of the marsh burials represent individuals who occupied unusual positions within the social and cultural landscape of the Baltic world. People who had lived for extended periods in other cultures, adopted certain of their material practices, and returned to their home communities carrying that experience with them in ways that their burial assemblages now, silently, record. Others have pointed to the vessel configurations themselves, the way certain of the buried watercraft are oriented, the specific spatial relationships between the human remains and the objects accompanying them, as suggesting ritual protocols that do not map cleanly onto the documented conventions of Norse burial practice. Influences, perhaps, from the Orthodox Christian or Islamic funerary traditions that Baltic traders encountered on their eastern journeys. A hybrid sacred vocabulary, expressed once, in private, at the moment of final interment, and then covered by marsh and centuries of accumulated sediment. The survey suggests that a significant number of vessels in this landscape remain unexcavated. The preserving conditions of the marsh mean that what lies within them has likely survived in considerable detail. The water table sits just below the surface of the low fields. The ground shifts subtly with the seasons, rising in winter, settling in summer, as it has for 1,000 years, making almost imperceptible adjustments around the things it holds. And beneath that quietly breathing landscape, in vessels that carried their occupants through life and were then trusted to carry them beyond it, the Baltic marsh keeps its inventory, patient, cold, and almost certainly not yet finished with its revelations. The Baltic marshes hold their dead with a particular possessiveness, a cold, patient grip that preserves what was placed within it: flesh, fabric, the distant objects of traveled lives, against the ordinary appetite of time. There is something almost generous about it. The marsh, indifferent to human meaning, nonetheless performs the function of memory more faithfully than most human institutions manage. But preservation is only half of what the historical record requires. The other half is presence. And what haunts us now? What pulls us northward, further into the Scandinavian world, further into the long winters and the granite coastlines and the cathedral cities that rose from Viking Age settlements like slow geological formations, is not a burial that preserved too much, but one that preserved nothing at all, because it was empty. Trondheim sits on the western coast of Norway, at the mouth of the Nidelva River, where it meets the Trondheim Fjord. It is a city of considerable age, and in the context of Norwegian history, enormous spiritual significance. Known in the medieval period as Nidaros, it was the seat of the Archbishop of Norway, and the destination of one of Northern Europe's most important pilgrimage routes, a journey that drew the faithful from across Scandinavia and beyond to a single point of sacred gravity at the city's heart. That point was Nidaros Cathedral. Built above the grave of Olaf Haraldsson, King Olaf II of Norway, killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 AD and canonized as Saint Olaf within 2 years of his death. The cathedral is one of the northernmost examples of medieval Gothic architecture in the world. Its construction spanned centuries. Its nave, its transepts, its famous west front with its tiers of sculpted figures, all of it oriented around a single theological and physical fact. The king was buried here. The saint was here. The sacred center of Norwegian Christianity was marked by the presence of these specific remains in this specific place. Except that when researchers and ecclesiastical authorities have, at various points across the modern period, attempted to definitively locate and confirm the physical remains of Saint Olaf within the cathedral structure, what they have encountered has been considerably more complicated than a straightforward confirmation of the tradition. The historical record of Saint Olaf's remains is, to use the most precise available term, chaotic. In the years immediately following his death and canonization, his body was interred near the site of his death and then moved, to Nidaros, where it became the focal point of his emerging cult. This much is documented. But the subsequent history of those remains involves a succession of translations, concealments, and relocations that the surviving records capture only partially and sometimes contradictorily. During the Reformation, which reached Norway in the 1530s under Danish royal pressure, the shrines and relics of Catholic saints became targets of deliberate destruction. The elaborate shrine of Saint Olaf, one of the most richly decorated in Northern Europe, was dismantled. Its treasures were seized, and the physical remains of the saint, the body that had anchored the spiritual geography of an entire kingdom for 5 centuries, were dealt with in a manner that the records of the period describe with a vagueness that has frustrated historians ever since. Some accounts suggest reburial within the cathedral. Others suggest removal. One source, cited by later historians but whose own origins are disputed, implies that the remains were dispersed, separated, distributed, in the way that the relics of major saints were sometimes divided across multiple sites to extend the reach of their sacred power, or to protect them from the possibility of total destruction. What is certain is this: when modern investigation has sought to confirm the location of a primary intact burial of Olaf Haraldsson within Nidaros Cathedral, the physical evidence has not cooperated with the historical expectation. The grave that should be there, the grave that the entire architectural logic of one of Scandinavia's greatest medieval buildings was designed to mark and house, does not yield what it should. The mainstream historical response to this situation is measured and appropriately cautious. Centuries of construction, renovation, fire, Reformation disruption, and the ordinary processes of institutional change within a living religious building are more than sufficient to account for the displacement or loss of specific remains. Nidaros Cathedral is not a static monument, but a building that has been continuously used, altered, and rebuilt across nearly 1,000 years. That a specific burial could be lost within that process is not historically surprising. But the specific quality of the absence at Nidaros has led some researchers to consider whether the remains were not lost, but moved, and whether the movement was deliberate, planned, and conducted with the explicit intention of creating exactly the kind of uncertainty that now surrounds the question. Institutions facing existential threat, and the Catholic Church in Reformation-era Norway was facing precisely that, sometimes made sophisticated decisions about the disposition of their most sacred objects. Not preservation in place, which was vulnerable, but dispersal, which was resilient. A relic divided across 5 locations is 5 times harder to destroy completely than a relic held in one. And a primary burial site emptied of its occupant, but maintained in its architectural magnificence, continues to function as a sacred focal point regardless of whether the physical remains are present. Did someone in the turbulent years of the Norwegian Reformation remove Olaf Haraldsson from his grave and send him somewhere safer? Somewhere that was never recorded, because the recording of it would have defeated the purpose? There are churches in Norway, small ones, rural ones, places that received donations and ecclesiastical attention during the medieval period that their size and location do not obviously explain, that some researchers have quietly noted as possible candidates for secondary interment sites. The pattern of certain endowments, the particular dedications of certain altars, the presence of specific architectural features that in other contexts are associated with the housing of significant relics. These details, taken individually, prove nothing. Taken together, they form a circumstantial argument that is not easily dismissed. The cathedral continues to draw pilgrims. The route to Nidaros is walked every year by thousands of people following the same path that medieval Christians walked in the same direction for the same purpose. The building rises above the river with the same authority it has always projected. The grave markers within it are tended with care. But beneath the stones that mark the center of Norwegian Christianity's sacred geography, the question that the Reformation left unanswered quietly persists. Is the grave empty because it was emptied? And if so, where did they take him? And does anyone still know? Nidaros left us with the particular unease of a container without its contents. A grave shaped around an absence. A cathedral oriented toward a center that may no longer hold what it was built to protect. And the quietly persistent possibility that the emptiness was not an accident of history, but a decision, made deliberately, under pressure, by people who understood exactly what they were doing and chose not to leave a record of it. It is a specific kind of institutional silence. The silence of an organization that knows how to keep a secret across centuries because its entire structure, its hierarchy, its vow culture, its understanding of obedience and discretion, was built, among other things, for exactly that purpose. The medieval church was many things, but it was also, when it needed to be, extraordinarily good at not saying what it knew. And nowhere does that capacity for institutional silence feel more present, more almost tangible, than at the far western edge of France, where the land runs out into the Atlantic and a ruined abbey stands at the tip of a peninsula, looking westward into a horizon that, for the medieval mind, marked the boundary of the known world. This is the Point Saint-Mathieu, the westernmost reach of Brittany in the Finistère department, whose name translates, with a directness that feels almost literary, as the end of the earth. The coastline here is not gentle. The Atlantic arrives with a quality of intention, breaking against granite headlands with the force of something that has crossed 3,000 miles of open ocean specifically to make this point. The wind is constant. The light on overcast days, and which are frequent, has a gray, diffuse quality that flattens distance and makes the horizon feel closer than it is. The Abbey of Saint-Mathieu rises from this headland with the authority of a structure that was built to be seen from the sea. Its tower still stands, incorporated into a working lighthouse that has guided ships past these dangerous waters since the 19th century. A continuity of function, if not of faith, that connects the Abbey's original purpose as a landmark for maritime navigation with the practical needs of the modern coastline. The Abbey was founded by tradition in the 6th century AD, associated with Breton Christian communities of the early medieval period whose origins are tangled with the broader movement of Celtic Christianity across the Atlantic coasts of Britain, Ireland, and northwestern France. It grew into a substantial Benedictine establishment by the high medieval period, documented, endowed, producing the administrative records that allow historians to trace the outlines of its institutional life across several centuries. And then, at a specific point in its history, a point whose precise dating is itself part of the problem. Something happened to its community. The monks were gone. Not all at once, and not without some documentary trace. But the records of Saint-Mathieu, examined carefully across the transition period in question, show a community that was present and functioning, and then, across what appears to be a relatively compressed time frame, was not. The expected continuity of abbots, of administrative decisions, of the ordinary institutional paperwork that Benedictine houses generated with considerable regularity, develops gaps, silences, entries that should exist and do not. The mainstream historical framework for understanding monastic community disruptions in medieval Brittany is well populated with potential explanations. The region experienced Viking raids of significant intensity during the 9th and 10th centuries, disruptions that devastated numerous religious establishments along the Breton coast and drove communities inland, dissolved institutions entirely, or reduced flourishing abbeys to skeletal remnants that took generations to recover. Plague in the 14th century moved through monastic communities with particular efficiency, given the enclosed and communal nature of religious life. Economic pressures, political disruptions, and the gradual consolidation of ecclesiastical authority under increasingly distant institutional control all created conditions in which small or mid-sized religious houses could simply, quietly, cease to function. Any of these forces, or some combination of them, could account for the disruption at Saint-Mathieu. But the specific texture of the documentary gap has led some researchers to look more carefully at what the surviving records do and do not say, and to notice something that the straightforward catastrophe narrative does not fully explain. The community at Saint-Mathieu, in the period immediately preceding the gap, appears in its records to have been engaged in activity that goes beyond the ordinary administration of a coastal Benedictine house. Correspondence, fragmentary, partially preserved, suggests contact with ecclesiastical authorities at a level disproportionate to the abbey's size and regional significance. Expenditures that the surviving accounts record without full explanation. References to arrivals and departures that the normal rhythms of monastic hospitality do not account for. Something was happening at Saint-Mathieu before the silence fell. What that something was, the records decline to specify. But the combination of unusual institutional activity and sudden community disruption has led certain researchers to consider whether the monks of Saint-Mathieu did not simply disappear, but were engaged in something. The transport of objects, the preservation of materials, the execution of a specific task assigned to them by a higher authority, that placed them in circumstances that ended badly. The Point Saint-Mathieu was not only the end of the earth in the metaphorical sense. It was a genuine embarkation point. Ships left from this coast for destinations across the Atlantic world, Ireland, England, Spain, and the broader network of Atlantic maritime routes that connected the Celtic Christian world long before the High Medieval period. A monastic community positioned here had access to maritime transport that inland houses lacked entirely. If something needed to be moved, if the kind of institutional decision that we have encountered before, in Nidaros, in Carthage, in San Millan, was made here too, the monks of Saint-Mathieu were uniquely positioned to execute it, and uniquely positioned, given the Atlantic at their door, to disappear in the attempt. The ruins retain a quality that is difficult to describe without sounding imprecise. It is not simply age or decay. It is the particular atmosphere of a place where something was interrupted, where the ordinary continuity of institutional life was cut, and the cutting was never explained, and the explanation, if it existed, left with whoever walked out of those gates for the last time and did not return. The lighthouse beam sweeps the water in its slow mechanical arc. The Atlantic continues its argument with the granite. The ruined nave fills with Atlantic light at certain hours, gray and diffuse and oddly beautiful. And the question that the missing monks left behind them, unanswered across the long Atlantic centuries, is simply whether they vanished into the ordinary chaos of medieval history, or whether they went somewhere deliberate, carrying something specific, and whether what they carried still exists somewhere at the far end of whatever journey this headland launched them on. The monks of Saint Mathieu walked out of history at the edge of the known world, with the Atlantic at their backs, and whatever they carried held close. Their disappearance had the quality of a departure. Purposeful, directional, aimed at something even if we cannot name it. The sea was there. The sea accepted them. And the horizon, indifferent as it has always been, closed behind them without comment. But not every disappearance has the mercy of a horizon. Some happen in the interior, in the quiet, landlocked heart of a landscape that offers no obvious exit, no coastline, no port, no convenient metaphor of the open water and whatever lies beyond it. Some disappearances happen in places so enclosed, so defined by their own stillness, that the absence they leave behind has nowhere to go. It simply accumulates, settles into the landscape like sediment, becomes over time indistinguishable from the silence that was already there. We travel now to Estonia, to the slow, flat interior of a country whose landscape seems designed to absorb rather than express. Low forests of pine and birch, wetlands that blur the boundary between ground and sky, and at the center of it all, a lake so large and so shallow that it behaves less like a body of water than like a feature of the atmosphere. A mirror that the land holds up to the sky, imperfect and shifting, never quite still enough to show a clear reflection. This is Lake Vortjarv, the second largest lake in Estonia, stretching roughly 30 kilometers from north to south and sitting at an elevation so modest that the surrounding landscape feels continuous with its surface, as though the lake is not a depression in the land, but simply a place where the land became temporarily transparent. In winter, it freezes. In spring, it floods. In summer, it retreats, exposing margins of reed and mud that carry the preserved traces of everything the water has touched across the centuries. It is a landscape of exceptional archaeological sensitivity, and it is the landscape within which, at some point during the late medieval period, a small monastic community established itself on or near the lake's western shore. And then, with a completeness that the surviving record struggles to account for, ceased to exist. The community in question is not famous. It does not appear in the major ecclesiastical histories of the Baltic region with the frequency or detail that would suggest a house of significant institutional importance. What we know of it comes primarily from administrative documents, episcopal records, land grants, correspondence between regional ecclesiastical authorities that reference it obliquely as one item among many in the management of a diocese stretched across a sparsely populated landscape. It was small. It was remote. It was, by the standards of medieval monastic establishments, unremarkable, which makes the nature of its disappearance from the record all the more difficult to explain. The community simply stops being mentioned. Not dissolved as far as the documents show. There is no record of a formal suppression, no transfer of its properties to another institution, no inventory of its goods conducted in the manner typical of an orderly closure. Not destroyed by external violence, at least not in any way that generated the kind of documentation that military or political events in the region typically produced. Not absorbed into a larger neighboring house, which was a common fate for struggling small communities, and which almost always left administrative traces in the receiving institution's records. It stops, cleanly, without apparent cause. The region around Lake Vortjarv in the late medieval period was not peaceful. The Baltic Crusades of the 13th century had transformed the religious and political landscape of Estonia with considerable violence, and the subsequent period of Livonian order control was one of sustained tension between Germanic ecclesiastical authority and the indigenous Estonian population, whose conversion to Christianity was recent, imperfectly achieved, and deeply complicated by the political context in which it had occurred. A small monastic community operating in this environment would have been navigating pressures that the official record only partially captures. The mainstream explanations for the community's disappearance exist within this historical framework and carry genuine weight. Plague, operating with particular lethality in isolated communities with limited access to the demographic recovery that larger settlements could manage. economic non-viability in a region where the resource base for sustaining religious establishments was thin and the institutional support network stretched. Low-level violence, not the kind that generates chronicle entries, but the persistent, undocumented friction between a colonizing ecclesiastical authority and a population that had not fully accepted what it had been told to accept, could, over time, make the continued existence of a small and exposed monastic community simply untenable. Any of these forces could have ended the community of Lake Vorcherv without leaving a clear documentary trace. Small things end quietly. But archaeological survey work conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries along the lake's western shore has produced findings that complicate the quiet ending narrative in ways that researchers have been working to understand ever since. Structural remains have been identified, partially submerged, partially buried beneath the accumulated sediment of several centuries of lake margin flooding, that appear consistent with a small religious establishment of the relevant period. The remains themselves are not surprising. What is surprising is the evidence of rapid, disorganized abandonment that they appear to preserve. Objects left in place that, in an orderly closure or even a plague-driven decline, would have been removed or redistributed. Spatial arrangements within the structural remains that suggest interruption rather than conclusion. The material record of people who left in circumstances that did not permit the ordinary processes of institutional wind-down. Liturgical objects, fragmentary but identifiable, found in locations within the site that suggest they were dropped or left where they fell, rather than stored or transported. Something ended this community's presence at Lake Vorcherv quickly, without the time or the capacity for the kind of careful departure that Saint Mathieu may have managed, or the deliberate concealment that Nidaros appears to have employed. And the people themselves, their remains, have not been found in any configuration that accounts for the full membership of even a small monastic house. A community of this type, operating for the period that the documents suggest, would have generated burials. A cemetery, however modest. The bones of the dead accumulated across decades of institutional life. These are absent in any form that the surveys have been able to locate. Where did the dead go? And where, more urgently, did the living go when whatever happened here happened? The Estonian landscape preserves things. The cold and the wet and the low oxygen conditions of the lake margin are, like the Baltic marsh that held its burial ships, genuinely archival in their properties. What entered this environment in the late medieval period and was not subsequently disturbed is likely still here in some form. Organic materials, fabric, wood, the objects of daily religious life that a community accumulates over generations. The surveys have covered the accessible margins, but Lake Vorcherv is shallow and large, and its shoreline has shifted across the centuries as water levels have fluctuated. What was once land is now water. What was once water is now reed marsh. The geometric relationship between the identified structural remains and the full extent of the community's physical footprint has not been established with confidence. There is more here than has been found. The lake's behavior, its seasonal flooding, its slow reshaping of the margins it governs, suggests that the most intact portion of whatever was left behind may lie in precisely the zone that is most difficult to investigate. Not deep water, but the ambiguous, shifting, neither land nor water margin that defines this landscape and that has, for centuries, quietly gone about the business of keeping what it was given. The reed beds move in the wind with a sound that is almost but not quite like voices. The lake surface reflects a sky that gives nothing away. And somewhere in the sediment beneath the fluctuating waterline, the physical record of a community that ended without explanation waits in the cold and the dark and the particular patience of things that have been still for a very long time. Did the monks of Lake Vorcherv flee, or were they taken? And is whatever they left behind still lying where it fell, preserved in the lake margin's cold indifference, waiting for the survey that finally asks the right question in the right place? Lake Vorcherv kept its secrets in water and sediment, and the slow, patient logic of a landscape that changes too gradually for any single generation to fully witness. The monks who disappeared there left their traces in the most archaeologically generous of environments: cold, wet, preserving. And yet even that generosity has not been enough to answer the questions their absence generates. There is something instructive in that. Preservation, it turns out, is not the same as revelation. The most careful archive in the world is useless if you cannot read what it contains. And sometimes the most complete preservation of all comes from the most violent and indiscriminate of forces. Forces that bury without intention, cover without care, and in doing so, accidentally achieve what no human institution could have managed deliberately. Sometimes the mystery is not hidden. It is simply buried. And nothing buries quite like the desert. We move now southward and eastward, away from the cold margins of the Estonian lake and into an environment of absolute opposite character. Heat instead of cold. Dryness instead of moisture. A landscape that preserves not through saturation but through desiccation, removing the water that decay requires, wrapping everything it covers in an airless, lightless, temperature-stable envelope that can maintain the integrity of organic materials across timescales that strain ordinary comprehension. The Egyptian desert. Specifically, the Western Desert. The vast, largely uninhabited expanse that stretches from the Nile Valley westward toward Libya, broken occasionally by oases whose isolation from the broader world made them, paradoxically, centers of intense human significance across several thousand years of history. These oases were not backwaters. They were nodes in trade networks, refugees for persecuted communities, and, from the early centuries of the Christian era onward, sites of some of the most significant monastic development in the history of the faith. The Desert Fathers, the early Christian hermits and community founders who retreated from the populated world into the Egyptian wilderness in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, and whose theological and practical innovations shaped the development of monasticism across the entire Christian world. Their influence is immeasurable. Their physical presence in the Western Desert left archaeological traces that continue to be discovered, assessed, and puzzled over in ways that the broader history of Christianity has not always adequately registered. Among those traces, among the known sites and the suspected sites, and the sites that exist only in fragmentary textual references that no physical evidence has yet confirmed, there is one whose story involves an event so sudden, so complete, and so geologically straightforward that its very simplicity is what makes it extraordinary. A monastery covered by a sandstorm, not gradually buried by the slow accumulation of desert sediment across centuries, as most buried desert sites are, but covered, according to a combination of geological survey evidence and the analysis of sediment layering at the site, within a period so compressed that the word overnight, while perhaps not literally precise, captures something essential about the nature of what happened. The site was identified in the latter decades of the 20th century during survey work in a region of the Western Desert whose distance from the established oasis settlements had led researchers to assume it was uninhabited during the early Christian period. The assumption was wrong. Ground-penetrating radar and subsequent limited excavation revealed structural remains beneath a sand deposit of unusual uniformity, the kind of layering that geologists associate with catastrophic Aeolian events. Massive sandstorms of the type that the desert generates with periodic, terrible efficiency when atmospheric conditions align in the right, or rather, the wrong, configuration. The structures beneath the deposit were not small. The footprint of the buried complex, as far as survey work has been able to establish it, suggests an establishment of meaningful scale, larger than a hermit cell or a small anchoritic cluster, but not so large as to have generated the kind of institutional documentary record that the major Egyptian desert monasteries produced. It sits in the middle range of what the early monastic tradition in this region is known to have produced. Known, but not always documented. What the limited excavation has recovered from the upper accessible layers of the site is consistent with monastic occupation of the late antique period, roughly the 4th through 6th centuries AD. Ceramic fragments, organic material remnants including what appears to be textile fiber, architectural features, doorways, internal divisions, what may be a chapel space, whose configuration matches the established typology of early Egyptian monastic architecture, with enough fidelity to confirm the identification beyond reasonable doubt. This was a monastery. It was functioning. And then the desert covered it. The straightforward geological narrative is well supported. The Western Desert has always been dynamic in ways that human occupation ignores at its peril. Sandstorms of catastrophic scale, events that can deposit meters of material in hours, are documented throughout the historical record of the region, and their capacity to bury settlements completely and rapidly is not in question. The site's burial was almost certainly a natural event, caused by nothing more mysterious than the intersection of wind, sand, and unfortunate geography. But the natural event raises questions that are entirely human in character. The sediment layering suggests the burial was rapid enough that the community had no significant time to respond. Unlike a slow encroachment, the kind that gives inhabitants weeks or months to remove valuables and relocate, this event appears to have been fast. Faster, perhaps, than the time required to gather the objects of a functioning monastic community and carry them to safety. Which means that beneath the portions of the site that have not yet been excavated, the majority of it, the interior spaces of this monastery, may be preserved in a state of interrupted occupation. Not cleared and closed, like the shrine beneath Carthage or the chamber beneath Samian. Not deliberately emptied, like the grave at Nidaros, but caught, fixed at a specific moment in time by a geological event that had no interest in what it was preserving and no awareness that it was preserving anything at all. The theological library of a late antique Egyptian monastery, even a small one, would be a find of extraordinary significance. The early centuries of Christian monasticism in Egypt produced textual traditions of enormous importance, many of which survive only in later copies of uncertain fidelity, and some of which are known to have existed but have not survived in any form at all. The Nag Hammadi texts, discovered in 1945 in a sealed jar not far from the Nile, recalibrated scholarly understanding of early Christianity in ways that are still being fully absorbed. They were found by accident, by a farmer digging in the ground. The buried monastery of the Western Desert has not been found by accident. It has been found by survey, identified by science, and then, for reasons that combine the practical difficulties of desert excavation with the complex institutional dynamics of Egyptian archaeological administration, left largely as it was found. Covered. Waiting. There are researchers who have dedicated significant portions of their professional lives to the question of what lies in the deeper, unexcavated sections of this site, who believe, on the basis of what the surveys suggest about the completeness and rapidity of the burial event, that the interior spaces are more intact than almost any comparable site in the history of early Christian archaeology. The desert accepts no timelines but its own. It covered this community without warning and without apology, and it has held what it covered with the absolute consistency of a material that does not corrode, does not flood, does not shift with the seasons in the way that the Estonian lake margin does. The sand above the buried monastery is indistinguishable from the sand around it. Flat, pale, indifferent. The sky above it is the same sky that was above it when the storm came, vast and blue and entirely uninvested in what lies beneath it. And somewhere in the preserved darkness under that unremarkable surface, in rooms that no human being has entered since the desert closed over them perhaps 15 centuries ago, the objects of a daily spiritual life may still sit exactly where they were left, undisturbed, unseen, and waiting with the infinite patience of things that have no awareness of how long they have been waiting. The buried monastery of the Western Desert asked us to consider what it means for something to be preserved without witness, rooms intact, objects in place, a community's daily life frozen at a specific catastrophic moment, and no one who remembers it, no one who was there, no continuity of knowledge connecting what was to what is now. The desert covered that community without warning, without the time for testimony, without the possibility of a last account. But not every ending is that silent. Some endings are witnessed. Some are recorded with the desperate, urgent precision of people who understood that what they were watching would not happen again, who set down what they saw with the particular intensity of those writing against time, against the approach of something that would, within hours or days, make writing itself impossible. And sometimes what they recorded, in that final lucid interval before the catastrophe, was something that no one, then or now, has been able to fully explain. We move now to the coast of Palestine, to the city of Acre, known in Arabic as Akka, in the Crusader period as Saint Jean d'Acre, positioned on a small peninsula where the Bay of Haifa meets the Mediterranean, a natural harbor that made it one of the most strategically significant ports in the entire eastern Mediterranean for the better part of 2,000 years. In the spring of 1291 AD, Acre was the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. Everything else had fallen. Jerusalem, decades earlier. The other Crusader cities, one by one, across the preceding century of Mamluk military pressure. Acre alone remained, a fortified, heavily populated city that was simultaneously a functioning commercial port, a refuge for the remnants of the Crusader enterprise, and a symbol of such concentrated theological and political significance that its fall would mark not merely a military defeat, but the effective end of 2 centuries of Latin Christian presence in the Levant. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived before its walls in April of 1291 with a force whose scale contemporaries described with a consistency that, even accounting for the tendency toward exaggeration in medieval military narrative, suggests something genuinely overwhelming. The siege was intense, methodical, and, as sieges conducted by Mamluk forces in this period characteristically were, prosecuted with an engineering sophistication that the defenders found difficult to counter. In this context, in the weeks and days before the final assault that would bring the walls down on the 18th of May, 1291, multiple witnesses recorded something above the city. A cross, dark in color, described variously as black, as deeply shadowed as a shadow in the form of a cross. Seen in the sky above Acre, or above specific structures within the city, by multiple independent observers whose accounts were recorded separately and whose descriptions align with enough consistency to exclude the possibility of a single embellished source propagating through the documentary tradition. The accounts are not marginal. They appear in chronicles produced by individuals with direct or near-direct connection to the events. Writers whose reliability on the factual details of the siege itself has been confirmed by cross-referencing with sources from the Mamluk side. These are not the kinds of sources that historians of the period dismiss lightly. The vision, if vision is the right word, was interpreted by those who saw it, uniformly and immediately, as an omen. In the theological vocabulary of the Crusader world, a cross appearing dark or inverted or in shadow carried specific eschatological weight. It was read as a sign of divine withdrawal, of abandonment, of the sacred protection that the cross symbolized being removed from the city and the enterprise it represented. Those who recorded it did so with the gravity of people who believed they were documenting a communication from a realm beyond the ordinary. The rational frameworks for understanding what was reported are multiple and genuinely compelling. Atmospheric optics in the eastern Mediterranean can produce visual phenomena of striking character: sundogs, halos, corona effects, and in specific meteorological conditions, dark or shadowed formations that can resemble geometric shapes with enough fidelity to be interpreted by observers as intentional. The psychological context of a population under siege, aware of the scale of the force arrayed against them, primed by theological expectation and profound collective anxiety, would have created conditions of heightened perceptual sensitivity in which ambiguous atmospheric phenomena were resolved, by observer after observer, into the form that carried the most concentrated symbolic meaning available to them. This is not a dismissal of the witnesses. It is, in fact, a recognition of how human perception actually works, how context shapes seeing, how meaning-making is inseparable from the act of observation, and how multiple independent witnesses can genuinely see the same thing and report it honestly while that thing remains, at its physical origin, something considerably more ordinary than what it appeared to be. but the consistency of the accounts, not just in the shape described, but in the quality of darkness, the location relative to specific structures, and the duration of the phenomenon, has led some researchers to look beyond simple atmospheric explanation. One line of inquiry focuses on the smoke. The siege of Acre involved sustained, large-scale use of incendiary materials. Greek fire, burning projectiles, the smoke of fires both deliberate and accidental that would have been present in the air above the city throughout the siege period. The interaction of smoke columns, strong Mediterranean sunlight, and specific wind conditions can produce shadow formations of considerable geometric regularity. A cross shape formed by the intersection of smoke shadow with architectural or atmospheric structure is not physically implausible. Another line of inquiry is more difficult to categorize. A small number of researchers have noted that the accounts of the phenomenon at Acre belong to a broader, largely unexamined tradition of anomalous visual phenomena reported above cities or sites at moments of historical crisis. A pattern that appears across cultures and periods with enough regularity to constitute, if not an explanation, at least a question worth asking carefully. Whether that pattern reflects something real in the physical world, something consistent in human psychology under extreme stress, or simply the tendency of crisis narratives to reach for available symbolic vocabularies, remains genuinely unresolved. What the fall of Acre represents in the longer arc of history adds a particular weight to the question of what was witnessed above it. The city's fall did not merely end the Crusader presence in the Levant. It triggered a dispersal of people, of objects, of institutional structures and their contents that sent fragments of the Crusader world in multiple directions simultaneously. Military orders relocated. Treasuries were evacuated in the chaos of the final days. Relics, manuscripts, and objects of sacred significance left Acre aboard whatever vessels could be reached, carried by whoever could carry them, destined for locations that the documentary record of the evacuation only partially captures. Some of what left Acre in those final days has been identified in its eventual destinations. Some has not. The last ships to leave the harbor of Acre before the walls fell carried people and objects whose subsequent histories are, in some cases, simply unknown, absorbed into the broader dispersal of the Crusader world's dissolution, lost in the records of institutions that received them without always noting what they had received or from where. The harbor of Acre is still there. The city built above the Crusader remains. Acre, a living city of layered history, continues its life above the buried architecture of the Latin East. Excavations beneath the modern city have revealed extraordinary material from the Crusader period and continue to do so. But what was seen in the sky above Acre in the spring of 1291, witnessed by multiple eyes, recorded by multiple hands, interpreted as the visible sign of something ending that could not be recovered, remains exactly what it was to those who saw it. Present, dark, shaped like the symbol of everything they were losing, and entirely without an explanation that closes the question completely. The fall of Acre gave us something rare in the historical record, an ending that was witnessed, documented in real time by people who understood the magnitude of what they were seeing and committed it to writing with the urgency of those who knew that the writing itself might not survive. The black cross seen above the city, whatever its physical origin, was absorbed into a broader act of testimony, a civilization's final hours, recorded by the people living them. Most endings are not witnessed that way. Most endings happen gradually, or ambiguously, or in places remote enough from the centers of documentary production that by the time anyone thought to write them down, the people who could have explained what happened were already gone. The record arrives late, incomplete, shaped by distance and the passage of time into something that raises more questions than it resolves. And then there are the endings that are not recorded at all, where the city simply stops, where the streets empty and the buildings stand and the infrastructure of a functioning urban life remains largely intact, and no chronicle, no administrative document, no letter or inscription captures the moment of departure or explains what drove it. These are perhaps the most disorienting abandonments of all. We travel now into the Negev desert of southern Palestine, into a landscape of extraordinary aridity and extraordinary historical depth, a region that has been crossed, settled, contested, and abandoned across several thousand years of human engagement with one of the most demanding environments on Earth. The Negev is not empty in the way that deserts are sometimes imagined to be empty. It is full of the traces of people who understood how to live here, who developed sophisticated relationships with its limited water and its seasonal rhythms, and who built, in some cases, cities of genuine scale and ambition in places where the modern eye sees only rock and dust and the shimmering compression of extreme heat. Shifta is one of those cities. It sits in the central Negev, roughly 50 kilometers southwest of the modern city of Beersheba, at an elevation that gives it long views across the surrounding plateau in every direction. There is no dramatic natural feature to explain its location. No river, no obvious trade route convergence, no defensible promontory. It sits where it sits because the people who built it understood the microhydrology of the desert with a precision that modern engineers have examined with genuine admiration. The city's water harvesting system, an intricate network of channels, reservoirs, and runoff collection surfaces that captured and stored every drop of the region's limited rainfall, represents a technical achievement that sustained urban life in a place that receives, in an average year, less than 100 millimeters of precipitation. Shifta was built primarily by the Nabateans, the remarkable desert trading civilization whose capital at Petra in modern Jordan is their most famous legacy, but whose influence extended across the Negev in a network of agricultural and commercial settlements that transformed the desert into a functioning, productive landscape. The city was later occupied and expanded during the Byzantine period, when it became a significant Christian community whose 3 churches, surviving in various states of preservation, are among the best preserved examples of Byzantine ecclesiastical architecture anywhere in the Negev. At its height, Shifta housed a population estimated in the thousands. It had paved streets, public spaces, wine presses of industrial scale, a functioning agricultural hinterland maintained by the same water harvesting technology that made the city possible in the first place. And then, at some point between the 7th and 9th centuries AD, the dating range itself is part of the problem. It was abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, not buried by the desert in the sudden catastrophic manner of the Western Desert Monastery. Simply left, the buildings standing, the churches intact, the infrastructure of the water system present, if no longer maintained. The city, in its physical form, largely surviving, as it survives today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site whose preservation owes as much to the Negev's desiccating climate as to any deliberate conservation effort. The mainstream historical explanations for Shifta's abandonment are well developed and draw on broader patterns of settlement change in the post-Byzantine Negev. The Arab conquest of the region in the 7th century transformed the political and economic landscape of Palestine in ways that affected desert settlements with particular severity. Trade routes shifted. The administrative infrastructure that had sustained Negev towns under Byzantine rule was reorganized or dissolved. Agricultural systems that depended on sustained collective maintenance, and Shifta's water harvesting was precisely such a system, are vulnerable to the disruption of the social structures that keep them functioning. Remove the institutional framework that organizes collective labor, and the desert reclaims its own with quiet efficiency. Climate change has also been invoked, a period of reduced rainfall in the 8th and 9th centuries that would have pushed an already marginal water harvesting system below the threshold of viability. Recent paleoclimatological research in the region has found evidence consistent with precipitation decline during this period, lending support to the environmental explanation. These frameworks are serious and evidentially grounded. They account for the general pattern of Negev settlement decline in the post-Byzantine period with reasonable coherence. But Shifta's abandonment has specific characteristics that sit uneasily within the general narrative. The speed of the departure, as the archaeological evidence suggests it, is difficult to reconcile with the gradual economic and environmental decline that the mainstream explanation posits. Sites abandoned through slow attrition, Populations drifting away over decades as conditions worsen tend to show the material signature of that process. Objects of value removed, structures cannibalized for building material, the gradual stripping of a place by people who are leaving incrementally, taking what they can as they go. Shivta does not show this signature clearly. What the archaeological record suggests in the sections of the site that have been most carefully examined is a departure that was relatively rapid. Not the overnight catastrophe of the sandstorm-buried monastery, but something considerably faster than the decades-long trickle that environmental decline typically produces. People left here without taking everything they could have taken, without dismantling what could have been usefully dismantled. The city was left in a state that implies, if not sudden flight, then at minimum a departure undertaken under conditions that precluded the ordinary processes of organized withdrawal. What those conditions were, the physical evidence declines to specify. Some researchers have pointed to the possibility of a specific triggering event, an epidemic perhaps of the kind that moved through populations in the 7th and 8th centuries with devastating efficiency, reducing a community below the threshold required to maintain the collective labor on which the water system depended, and doing so quickly enough to produce exactly the rapid abandonment signature that the site shows. A city whose water system fails in the Negev summer does not have the luxury of a slow, considered departure. Others have noted that Shivta's 3 churches show no evidence of deliberate damage or desecration, a detail that argues against violent expulsion as the mechanism, and that some researchers have found suggestive of a community that left its sacred spaces intact by choice, that walked away from its churches as from places that would, in some imagined future, be returned to, a departure conceived as temporary that simply never reversed. The streets of Shivta are walkable today. The stone is warm in the desert sun. The doorways of the Byzantine houses open onto the same light they opened onto 15 centuries ago, and the silence they open onto is absolute. The deep, total silence of a place that was built for human noise and has not heard any for longer than the interval between its founding and its abandonment. What made the people of Shivta leave their churches standing and their streets intact and their water system in place as though they expected to return? And wherever they went in the desert summer of whatever year it was, did they look back at what they were leaving? And did they believe, as they walked away, that the leaving was not permanent? Shivta left its doors open, its churches standing, its streets intact and its water channels in place, as though the people who built them had only stepped away for a moment and fully intended to return. It is an abandonment that feels less like an ending than a pause, a held breath that simply never released. And the quality of that incompleteness, that suspended expectation, follows you out of the desert and westward across the ancient world. Because that quality, of something interrupted, something preserved in a state of unresolved waiting, is not unique to the Negev. It appears in different registers and different landscapes, wherever human communities have been separated from what they made with a suddenness or a completeness that left no space for proper conclusion. Sometimes what is left behind is architecture. Sometimes it is objects. Sometimes it is a single thing, modest in size, enormous in significance, whose absence from the place it belongs has echoed across centuries of institutional memory with a persistence that refuses to be absorbed into ordinary historical loss. We travel now to the heart of Ireland, to the Shannon River, where it widens into a broad, slow curve through the Midland counties, and where the light, even in summer, carries a softness that the Irish landscape seems to generate from within itself rather than receive from the sky. This is not dramatic terrain. It is gentle, layered, deeply green, and possessed of a quality of age that expresses itself not in monuments or dramatic geology, but in the accumulated weight of continuous human presence across a very long time. On the west bank of the Shannon in County Offaly, the monastic site of Clonmacnoise occupies a low ridge above the river with the quiet authority of a place that knows what it is. Founded in 544 AD by Saint Kieran, one of the 12 Apostles of Ireland, as the tradition names them, Clonmacnoise became, across the following centuries, one of the most significant centers of Christian learning, manuscript production, and ecclesiastical authority in the entire Gaelic world. It was not simply a monastery. It was a cultural capital, a place where kings were buried, where scholarship of European significance was produced, where the intersection of spiritual and political power was negotiated across generations of Irish history. Its physical remains, round towers, high crosses, cathedral ruins, a collection of carved grave slabs whose quality is extraordinary even in their current weathered state, communicate something of what it was, but only something. The gap between the physical residue and the living institution it represents is, as it always is with such sites, vast and largely unrecoverable. Among the many things that Clonmacnoise is known to have possessed, manuscripts, relics, objects of gold and silver whose existence is attested in historical sources, and whose current locations range from major museum collections to complete unknown. There is one whose disappearance has generated a particular quality of sustained, unresolved attention. The Bell of St. Kieran. Not a decorative object, not a ceremonial piece, a bell of the type central to early Irish monastic life, handbells of cast bronze or iron, used to call communities to prayer, to mark the hours of the divine office, to define the acoustic boundaries of sacred time in communities organized entirely around the rhythm of liturgical practice. These bells were not interchangeable instruments. They were personal objects associated with specific saints, considered to carry the spiritual authority of their original owners and treated as relics of the First Order. The bells of Irish saints were among the most venerated objects in the Gaelic ecclesiastical tradition, objects whose possession conferred legitimacy, whose loan or gift carried profound political and spiritual meaning, and whose theft was considered an act of sacrilege equivalent in gravity to the violation of a tomb. Several such bells have survived: the Bell of St. Patrick, the Loughlane Bell, the Bernang Chiaran, a bell associated with Kieran that some sources identify with Clonmacnoise and that survives in the National Museum of Ireland, are among the examples whose physical continuity from the early medieval period to the present represents a remarkable chain of preservation and institutional memory. But the sources that deal with Clonmacnoise across its history make reference to a bell. The bell, in the specific and weighted sense that suggests an object of primary significance, whose trajectory through the historical record does not terminate in a known collection. It is referenced. It is described with enough specificity to distinguish it from other bells associated with the site. And at a certain point, the references stop. The site of Clonmacnoise was raided repeatedly across its history. Vikings, Irish rivals, Anglo-Norman forces. The annals record these raids with a specificity that reflects their traumatic impact on communities that experience them. The burning of structures, the removal of treasures, the deaths of community members. Objects of value left Clonmacnoise involuntarily on multiple occasions across several centuries of institutional vulnerability. The mainstream explanation for the bell's absence from the known record is straightforward and historically reasonable. It was taken. During one of the many raids that the annals document, an object of this significance and material value would have been a primary target. Bells of cast bronze were objects of considerable metallic value, independent of their religious significance, and raiders operating outside the cultural framework that made them sacred would have seen them primarily as material. This is probably the correct explanation in its broad outlines. Theft, during a period when theft was a constant occupational hazard of monastic life in Ireland, accounts for the absence of more sacred objects than any other mechanism in the Irish ecclesiastical record. But the specific bell associated with Kieran and with Clonmacnoise has attracted a different set of possibilities, supported by a different set of evidence that the straightforward theft narrative does not fully address. There is a tradition, not well documented in the major annalistic sources, but present in local oral and manuscript traditions of the region, that the bell was not taken, but hidden. That in anticipation of a specific threat, at a specific moment in the site's turbulent history, members of the community made the decision to conceal it. Not to remove it from the site entirely, but to place it somewhere within the broader landscape associated with Clonmacnoise, the river, the surrounding terrain, the network of associated sites and properties that extended outward from the monastic center, where it could be recovered when the threat had passed. The threat, whatever it was, apparently did not pass in the way that was anticipated. Or the people who knew where the bell was placed did not survive to recover it, or the recovery was made and not recorded, or the tradition of its hiding preserved a memory of intention rather than of execution. The Shannon Valley has yielded extraordinary objects across the history of Irish archaeology, items deposited in rivers, bogs, and lake margins across several thousand years of human occupation, recovered by chance, by drainage work, by the slow attrition of riverbank erosion, the practice of depositing objects of significance in water for ritual reasons, for safekeeping, for motivations that the archaeological record can identify but not always interpret, was widespread and sustained across Irish prehistory and history. A bell placed in the Shannon or in one of the smaller waterways of the Clonmacnoise landscape for safekeeping in a period of crisis would have entered a preservation environment of considerable efficacy. Cast metal in cold anaerobic riverbed conditions can survive for very long periods. The Shannon has not been comprehensively surveyed for its subsurface archaeological content. The associated landscape of Clonmacnoise, its fields, its river margins, its small islands, has not been exhaustively examined. The round tower of Clonmacnoise still stands above the Shannon, its doorway elevated above ground level in the manner of structures designed to be defended and to outlast whatever threatened them. The high crosses stand in their cases, protected from further weathering. The river moves past with the unhurried persistence that rivers bring to everything. And somewhere, in the water, in the ground, in a location recorded once in a tradition that has thinned across the centuries to near invisibility, the bell that called a community to prayer for generations may still be waiting, in the patient dark of the river or the soil, for the hand that was supposed to retrieve it and never came. The bell of Clonmacnoise waits somewhere in the Shannon Valley, in the river, in the ground, in a location that the tradition remembers as having existed without quite remembering where. It is an absence defined by an object, a specific, nameable thing whose disappearance from the place it belongs has generated centuries of sustained, unresolved attention precisely because it was once so present, so central, so acoustically defining of the community that depended on it. But not every significant absence is defined by what is missing. Some are defined by what is present and wrong. We move now from the green river margins of the Irish Midlands southward and eastward, across the Mediterranean world and deep into the African continent, following the Nile upstream into the region the ancient world called Nubia. Into a landscape that shifts as you move south from Egypt, from the familiar iconography of pyramids and temples into something older and less visited. A terrain of desert and river and scattered archaeological sites whose significance to the broader history of northeastern Africa has been chronically underestimated by a scholarship that for too long looked primarily northward toward Cairo and Alexandria for its organizing frameworks. The Nile in Nubia is different from the Nile in Egypt, narrower in places, more interrupted, broken by the cataracts, those stretches of rocky rapids that made navigation difficult and defined the natural boundaries between the civilizations that developed along the river's length. The landscape on either bank shifts between desert plateau and thin strips of cultivable land, with settlements historically concentrated in the narrow zones where the river's annual flood could reach and the soil could support agriculture. It is in this landscape, specifically in the stretch of the Nile Valley in what is today Sudan, in the region historically associated with the medieval Christian kingdoms of Nubia, that a burial site was excavated in the latter decades of the 20th century, whose findings have generated a sustained and unresolved conversation among physical anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians of the medieval African world. Kulubnardi, a site associated with a small island community in the Nubian Nile, occupied primarily during the medieval period, roughly the 6th through 15th centuries AD, when this region formed part of the Christian Nubian kingdoms, whose sophistication and longevity we touched on earlier in this exploration, in our visit to Old Dongola. The community at Kulubnardi was not a major urban center. It was modest, a small settlement of the kind that populated the Nubian Nile Valley in considerable numbers during the Christian period, sustained by agriculture, connected to the broader institutional life of the Nubian church, and leaving in its cemetery the physical record of several generations of lives lived and ended in this specific place. The cemetery at Kulub Nardi was excavated with considerable care, and the skeletal remains recovered from it have been among the most extensively studied in the entire corpus of medieval Nubian physical anthropology. The sample is large enough to be statistically meaningful. The preservation is sufficient to allow detailed analysis. And what that analysis revealed in the careful and precise language of the relevant academic literature is a population whose physical characteristics do not correspond to what the geographic and historical context of the site would lead a researcher to expect. The individuals buried at Kulub Nardi show a pattern of skeletal morphology that has been described in the technical literature as representing a distinct biological population, one with characteristics that differ meaningfully from the surrounding Nubian populations of the same period as represented in other cemeteries along the Nile. The differences are not subtle variations within a broadly shared genetic heritage. They are significant enough that researchers examining the skeletal series have consistently identified it as representing people who were, biologically, from somewhere else. The term faceless in the title of this chapter refers not to any physical feature of the skulls themselves, but to the identity problem that this biological distinctiveness creates. These people cannot be placed. Their geographic origins, based on the physical evidence of their bones, do not match the available comparative data from the medieval Nubian world in a way that allows confident identification. They had faces. They had lives. They had a community that buried them with the care evident in the arrangement of the graves. And we cannot determine who they were or where they came from. The mainstream responses to this finding have developed along several lines. One emphasizes the complexity of population movement in medieval Nubia, a region that sat at the intersection of multiple long-distance trade and migration routes, and that absorbed, across its history, individuals and communities from a wide range of geographic origins. The Nubian Christian kingdoms maintained diplomatic and commercial contacts with Egypt, with sub-Saharan Africa, with the broader Indian Ocean trading world. A community with an unusual biological profile could reflect any number of migratory histories that the documentary record of the period captures only partially. Another response focuses on the methodological challenges of interpreting skeletal morphology in terms of geographic origin, a field whose analytical frameworks have evolved considerably since the Kulub Nardi material was first examined, and whose conclusions carry inherent uncertainty that the strongest statements about the site's population sometimes obscure. These are legitimate scholarly qualifications. They should be taken seriously, but they do not fully dissolve the question that the Kulub Nardi skeletal series poses. Because the biological distinctiveness of the population is not a marginal finding or a product of outdated methodology. It has been confirmed by subsequent analysis using more recent techniques. These people were different from their neighbors in ways that their bones record with the unambiguous permanence of biological fact. And the question of how a community of biologically distinct individuals came to be living and dying on a small island in the medieval Nubian Nile. How they got there, why they stayed, whether they knew they were different from the surrounding population, and whether that difference mattered to them or to others, remains open. Some researchers have raised the possibility of a community in exile. The medieval period in northeastern Africa and the broader Indian Ocean world was one of considerable population displacement. Religious minorities, political refugees, trading communities that established themselves in locations chosen for their remoteness or their defensibility rather than their agricultural potential. A small island in the Nubian Nile, accessible but not easily approached, belonging to a Christian kingdom that may have offered protection to communities that needed it. This is a plausible context for the establishment of an exile or refugee community whose biological origins lay far from where they ended up being buried. Others have pointed to the trading networks that connected Nubia to the broader Afro-Asiatic world, and to the possibility that Kulub Nardi represents a community established in connection with specific commercial functions. intermediaries perhaps, in one of the long-distance exchange systems that the Nile Valley facilitated, drawn from a population whose geographic origins reflect the reach of those networks rather than the local demographic baseline. And there are those who have noted, without drawing firm conclusions, that the biological profile of the Kulubnardi population has not been convincingly matched to any specific source population in the available comparative database. Which is to say that not only do we not know who these people were, we do not currently have the comparative material to determine with confidence where, in the broad geography of the medieval world, their biological heritage originated. They came from somewhere. They lived and died in this specific bend of the Nubian Nile. They were buried with care by people who knew them. And the bones that carry their identity have told us, with precision and consistency, that they were not from here, without yet being willing to tell us where here was for them before Kulubnardi became the place where their story ended. The Nile moves past the island with the same current it has always carried. Southward above, northward below, the desert holding its distance on both banks. And in the carefully tended graves of a community that has left no name and no origin story in any document that has survived, the bones of people who traveled, or were brought, or were born to parents who traveled, to this specific island in this specific river, ask the question that identity always asks when its answer has been lost. Who were we? And does anyone still know the way back to where we came from? The people of Kulubnardi asked us the hardest version of the identity question. Not who are you, but where did you come from? And what brought you to this specific place, on this specific river, far enough from wherever that place was that the journey itself became the last thing your bones recorded? We cannot answer them. The biological evidence is precise, and the historical context is entirely silent on the question of origin. They arrived, they lived, they died, and the distance between the place their bodies remember and the place where they were buried remains, for now, unmeasurable. But identity is not only a matter of geography, it is also a matter of experience, of what happens to a person, or a community, and how that happening leaves its mark. And sometimes what leaves the most indelible mark is not a place, or a journey, or an object. Sometimes it is something that no one can fully see. Something that moves through a community not in the manner of ordinary illness, with its visible symptoms, its biological logic, its pattern of transmission that medicine can eventually chart and name, but in a manner that the people experiencing it struggle to describe in any language except the language of shadow, of weight, of a darkness that is not quite external and not quite internal, but occupies, somehow, the boundary between the two. We travel now to the monasteries of the Syriac Christian tradition, to a world that occupies, in the popular imagination, considerably less space than its historical significance deserves. The churches and monastic communities of what is today southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, and northern Iraq, whose origins reach back to the very earliest centuries of Christian institutional life and whose theological, liturgical, and intellectual contributions to the broader history of Christianity are vast and largely unrecognized outside specialist circles. The Syriac monasteries were not peripheral institutions. Establishments like Mor Gabriel in the Tur Abdin region of southeastern Turkey, founded by tradition in 397 AD and continuously inhabited ever since, making it one of the oldest functioning Christian monasteries in the world, or the great monastic complexes associated with the Church of the East further eastward, were centers of scholarship, translation, and theological development whose influence extended across the medieval world from the Byzantine West to the Tang Dynasty East. Syriac-speaking monks and scholars translated Greek philosophy into Arabic. They carried Christianity to China and India. They produced manuscript traditions of extraordinary richness that are still being fully assessed by scholarship. And in the documents they produced, in the chronicles, the correspondence, the spiritual diaries, and community records that survive in libraries from London to Baghdad, there are references, distributed across several centuries and multiple monastic communities, to something that the writers describe with a consistency that has attracted the attention of researchers working at the intersection of medical history, psychology, and religious studies. They call it in the Syriac sources by terms that translate approximately as the shadow sickness, or the illness of darkness, or in some texts, simply the weight. It is described not as a physical disease in the manner that the same documents describe plague, fever, or the specific somatic illnesses that monastic medical knowledge cataloged with considerable sophistication. It is described as something that affects individuals and, in some accounts, entire communities, spreading through a monastery not through physical contact, but through proximity, through shared space, through the accumulated atmosphere of an environment in which it has taken hold. The symptoms described in the sources are consistent across accounts that span centuries and considerable geographic distance. A progressive withdrawal from ordinary engagement, with work, with prayer, with community life. A quality of heaviness that the writers struggle to locate precisely. Not in the body, not in the mind, but somewhere between them. A loss of the capacity for what the Syriac monastic tradition called watchfulness, the alert, attentive spiritual presence that was considered the foundation of the contemplative life. And in the more severe cases described, a condition that the sources approach with evident unease, in which the affected individual appears to lose the ability to distinguish between the interior and exterior world in ways that their community found profoundly alarming. The modern reader will recognize in these descriptions something familiar. The scholarly consensus on the shadow sickness of the Syriac sources identifies it, with reasonable confidence, as a historical precursor to what the medieval Latin West called acedia, a condition recognized in the early Christian monastic tradition as one of the 8 logismoi, the troubling thoughts or spiritual conditions that threaten the contemplative life. Acedia is typically translated as sloth, though the translation is misleading. It was understood in the monastic psychology of late antiquity as something considerably more serious than laziness, a profound spiritual and psychological condition whose symptoms overlap substantially with what modern medicine would recognize as clinical depression. This identification is well supported. The phenomenology of the shadow sickness as described in the Syriac sources maps coherently onto both the acedia tradition in broader Christian monasticism and onto the clinical presentation of depressive disorders as understood in contemporary psychiatry. Monastic communities, with their combination of social isolation, repetitive schedule, physically demanding ascetic practice, and intense psychological pressure to maintain constant spiritual attentiveness, were environments that could generate and sustain depressive states with particular efficiency. But the shadow sickness, as described in the Syriac sources, has characteristics that the straightforward acedia identification does not fully accommodate. The communal spread documented in some accounts is the most significant of these. Individual acedia, one monk's spiritual crisis, is well attested and well explained within the existing framework. But the Syriac sources include accounts, from multiple periods and locations, of the shadow sickness moving through an entire community in a manner that the writers explicitly describe as contagious. Not metaphorically contagious, not simply the observation that one person's spiritual state affects those around them, which any psychologically observant community would note, but literally spreading, individual to individual, in a pattern that the writers found terrifying, precisely because it did not respond to the ordinary spiritual interventions that individual acedia was known to yield to. What was spreading through these monasteries? Medical historians have proposed several frameworks. Mass psychogenic illness, the well-documented phenomenon in which psychological symptoms spread through a community via social and psychological mechanisms, producing genuine physical and mental effects in individuals who have not been exposed to any biological pathogen, is a robust explanatory framework that fits the communal spread pattern without requiring anything beyond established medical understanding. Others have looked at the specific environmental conditions of the affected monasteries, enclosed spaces, particular building materials, water sources, the possibility that specific locations, rather than the spiritual condition of their inhabitants, were generating the symptoms, through mold exposure, through water contamination, through the kind of infrasound-mediated effects that we encountered at Lagina, has been raised by researchers willing to look at the physical environment of these communities as a variable rather than a neutral backdrop. And then there are the accounts themselves, a small number of them, from specific monasteries in specific locations, that describe the shadow sickness in terms that neither the acedia framework nor the psychogenic illness model fully absorbs. Accounts that describe not a gradual onset, but a sudden arrival. Not a slow spreading through a community, but a transformation that the writers date to a specific night, a specific change in the atmosphere of a specific place. Accounts that connect the onset to particular spaces within the monastery, particular rooms, particular corridors, with a geographic specificity that suggests the writers were not describing a community-wide spiritual failure, but something they experienced as located. The Syriac manuscript tradition is vast and incompletely studied. Significant portions of it remain untranslated. The shadow sickness accounts that researchers have identified represent a fraction of what the full corpus likely contains. And in the untranslated pages of manuscripts that have waited in monastery libraries and museum collections across centuries for the scholar who will finally read them carefully, there may be accounts of the shadow sickness that are more specific, more located, and more difficult to explain than anything yet examined, waiting in the same patient darkness that the illness itself was said to bring.